Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you find yourself. Welcome to this CSIS Stanford University event, the Big Data China 2022 Annual Conference. China at Home and Abroad, Opportunities and Fears. We're delighted to have all of you with us today for this first conference that celebrates the first anniversary of this collaboration between the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics and Stanford University Center on China's Economy and Institutions. This began as an idea about 2 years ago about finding ways to strengthen the relationship and connectivity between the scholarly community and the public policy community, particularly in Washington, D.C. And as those of you who followed the Trustee Chair, Sky and Big Data China, we have been issuing features over the last year on a range of topics, introducing the policy community to cutting edge research, explaining what the findings are and the implications for the policy community. Today, we're delighted to launch the first annual conference that tries to emphasize these type of ties and explain how they are important to Washington and focus on several critical issues. In the coming hours, we will have 3 panels on economic policy, one on COVID-19 policy, and a final one on U.S. China relations. We have a star-studded group of experts that will be speaking in each of these panels, moderated by myself, my colleague Ilaria Mazzacco, who runs Big Data China day-to-day for us here at CSIS and has authored many of the features, and Scott Rozelle, our partner at Sky at Stanford University. All of the information of the today's agenda is on the website, but we're going to begin today with a special treat to have a keynote address from Ken Lieberthal, who is going to put in context many things about today's events and U.S. China relations and the relationship between scholarship and the policy community. There is no better person to get today's conference started than Ken. Ken's career is really, I would divide it into 3 phases, each of which he has made a tremendous impact. And the first, excuse me, the phone's going off. The first is he was a professor for many years, originally at University of Michigan from 1983 to 2009. He was the Arthur F. Thurnow Professor of Political Science and the William Davidson Professor of Business Administration. He then had, in the middle of that, he served on the National Security Council as Senior Director for Asia during the Clinton administration. And then he worked at the Brookings Institution as a Senior Fellow and as head of the Thornton Center for China Studies. So he has worked on both sides of the policy and scholarly community and as a bridge in the think tank community as well. He is insightful about just about every aspect of Chinese politics. Those of us who are in the China policy community and scholars and policymakers see Ken as a mentor and as defining a lot of the terms of how we look at China. If you look at Chinese politics and the policymaking process, you have probably encountered the idea of fragmented authoritarianism, and which basically is a central way that for decades we have thought about how policy is made in China. Even today, his work is still extremely influential for all of us. Ken, we are really delighted and grateful for you to join us to provide the keynote address to open this first annual conference. Let me turn it over to you. Look forward to your initial remarks. And then I appreciate that you've said you've been able to stick around and take a few questions before we then go on to the panels. So over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. It's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to kick off this conference. And you asked me to make some overall comments about U.S. China relations and what we should anticipate. And then perhaps even more in our brief dialogue afterwards, we can get into more specifics about issues I've raised, but also about the scholarly community and its potential roles. So let me dive into that. Certainly recently, we've had very visible efforts by both the United States and China to put a floor under the downward spiral in U.S.-China relations. And that spiral had been accelerating and had become really quite dramatic. The highlight of this turnaround, if you will, was the summit meeting last month in Bali between Presidents Biden and Xi, where they agreed to specified official dialogues going forward, to renewed cooperation on climate change, and indeed Secretary or Special Envoy now, Kerry, has already been in contact with his counterpart, Xie Zhenhua, to promote that. And more broadly, looking forward to regularized communications to prevent miscalculation that might lead to conflict. Xi Jinping has begun really a very active international diplomacy, something that he had shied away from during the prolonged COVID, basically closure of China. China is now, as we all know, exiting very rapidly from COVID lockdowns, and more broadly is taking measures to open up to the international community. I think we'll anticipate far more flows of people, of investment, of just exchanges of various sorts, and so forth. President Biden, in the wake of the midterm elections, feels that he still has room for a very active foreign policy. To put it slightly differently, in the run-up to the 20th Party Congress in Beijing and to the midterm elections in the U.S., both leaders were concentrating on domestic politics and frankly taking a pretty hard line on almost all related bilateral issues. In the wake of those meetings, both leaders see opportunities to be a little more flexible, to look abroad more, and take new initiatives. Having said that, looking at the upcoming year, I think that expectations about U.S.-China relations should remain very modest. The dialogues that were agreed to at the summit, I believe, are shallow and are confined to really very narrow channels. They aren't, getting together leaders of a variety of ministries with a variety of cabinet leaders in the U.S. or multiple levels within each of those bureaucracies. They're really quite confined to very, very specific channels and very few people directly engaged in them. On both sides, moreover, even as these dialogues are unfolding and initiatives are being taken to improve the atmosphere, each country is continuing to develop and to adopt security, economic, and diplomatic initiatives that are specifically designed to constrain the opportunities available to the other side. We can discuss details of that, Scott, when you pose questions after I wrap up these brief remarks. I want to focus here really on what to me are the most fundamental problems as we look forward. And at the top of that list is what has clearly has been evident for a long time, but I think has deepened and matured, and that is each side's distrust of both the short-term and the long-term intentions of the other side. That distrust is wide-ranging and is deep. On the Chinese side, the policymakers there overall are convinced that the U.S. is determined to constrain and, if necessary, disrupt China's rise. China views the U.S., moreover, to me quite remarkably, but nevertheless views the U.S. as strategic, disciplined, and highly coordinated across both domestic and international spheres. Again, anyone who's worked in the U.S. government finds it hard to believe that anyone would walk away with that impression. This is over any administration. But that remains a very surprisingly pervasive view among policymakers in China. China's conclusion is that the PRC must remain vigilant and able to defend its vital interests against U.S. power and perfidy. And this takes the form, in many ways, of an underlying conspiracy theory. Even if you point to things that the U.S. is doing that belies that notion of we're trying to constrain China's rise and, if necessary, even disrupt their capabilities, they can always explain, and have explained it to me in private conversations over the years, as just shows how tricky you are and how skillful you are as you pursue your long-term, very nefarious goals. On the U.S. side, American officials are convinced that China is unconstrained by law, ethics, or agreements. The U.S. can always count on China to have a long-term plan and to cheat where necessary in order to bring that plan closer to fruition. Xi Jinping, in the U.S. view, is able to dictate and coordinate everything China does, both domestically and internationally, across all spheres of activity. And China's aim in all of this is to hasten the decline of the United States and to restructure the global order in its favor. Against this background, both sides want to improve the atmospherics. They want to engage in some mutually beneficial cooperation. They certainly want to reduce the chances of actual miscalculations leading to conflict. But both sides are actively pursuing concrete measures to impinge on the core interests of the other side. And neither side, moreover, either understands the other side's decision-making and politics, or fathoms how its own actions have provoked what it sees as the hostile steps the other side is taking. So I'm arguing here that there is, to an extent that I think would surprise leaders on each side, a fundamental misunderstanding or lack of understanding of the complex nuance and detailed politics on the other side, how the systems there function, and therefore how to understand what they're doing and how to deal with them. I also worry about the wisdom of many of the key measures being taken by each side. Just briefly, for example, on the U.S. side, are measures to deal with China and to constrain its nefarious activities are increasingly, to my mind, protectionist, often involving relatively or too crude industrial policies. They are focused around the concept of competition, but competition is kind of an all-purpose rationale. It's not a recognizable strategy. Everything is to compete to China, but strategy involves, specification of goals and timelines and benchmarks and prioritization of resources and so forth. And it's very difficult to elicit that from U.S. officials who are competing with China. It also has involved, unfortunately, regarding Taiwan, talking very loudly, even if you are not wielding as big a stick as you need. That is, to my mind, provocative and in many ways counterproductive. And in high tech and universities, our policies are increasingly driving Chinese talent away rather than attracting it and making the best and brightest of the Chinese among those of many other countries part of the U.S. Magic sauce, if you will, to maintain our innovation capabilities. So, I think these things are, in many ways, you can understand each policy, but it is worrisome to see how they kind of move against the things that we have always tried to protect that's core to what makes the U.S. special and so highly competitive. I think that much of the above reflects an inability on each side to think in terms other than of caricature and assumptions that lead to self-fulfilling prophecies at this point. The array of serious discussion of major alternatives as versus tactical moves, I think, is notably thin. And that's a very serious problem. So during the coming year, on balance, I think we will have meetings that seek to nurture a more positive atmosphere, and there will be initiatives that may reduce the chances of miscalculation and tragedy, all of which is obviously worth doing and should be encouraged. But even this is likely to be disrupted by events for months at a time. Incidents such as the odds are if McCarthy becomes the Speaker of the House, he probably will, that he'll visit Taiwan sometime late in the spring, and that will evoke a response from the PRC that will be fully the equivalent of what they did when Nancy Pelosi went there last year, and will set back the relationship for a period of months before it gets patched together again. So it's going to be rocky. The atmospherics may be somewhat better overall. It's going to be rocky, and I don't think the fundamentals are moving in the right direction at all. Now, within that context, we really need to address the role of scholars. I know that that's a lot of what this conference will be doing. I'd be happy to follow up on that, but I think it's time to let you direct the conversation, Scott, and I'm happy to respond to whatever you want to raise.
Ken, that was terrific. Really appreciate those open and framing remarks about where the relationship stands. I'm not reassured by the substance of what you had to say, but I think you put it together quite clearly. What you said reminded me of, I think it was Joseph Nye who said, if you treat China as enemy, you may get an enemy. But the opposite is true. If China treats the U.S. as an enemy, you'll get an enemy. So maybe we've got both things happening. And I don't know if there's someone in China, a Joe Nye in China, who's written that for the Chinese. But it looks like we are engaging in this back and forth. And I don't know if you'd call it a security dilemma where we keep pushing the other to respond in ways that make the other side feel at risk. I wanted to first start. I want to ask a couple questions just on the policy side, and then talk about scholars and that bridge and what we can do. Is first of all, there's been some questioning in Washington, D.C. about the historic American policy towards China. You served in the Clinton administration in the late 90s, just prior to China joining the WTO. And so you were part of putting together policies, which I guess it's largely summed up by some as engagement. But of course, there was deterrence as well at that time. What do you think about the today's look backward to the 90s, and some saying, you know what, we should have been tougher on China all along, that the efforts to connect and build ties, we're now seeing that we basically gave China a free pass, and we would have been better off doing something different. What's a brief response to that kind of charge, which I find all over Washington?
I think that charge is a prime example of historical revisionism. And I think a number of the people who have articulated that argument and really gave it currency are people who know better, because they participated in it and they know how inaccurate that is. I'll leave it to them to explain, why they're pursuing the views they now are. Every step we made with China over a course of decades was behind the scenes, hard fought. Nothing came easily. You patch it up in public pronouncements, nothing came easily on either side. I never heard within the administration, within any administration, the assumption that if we pursue engagement with China, China will become a democracy just like us. And the big critique is, well, they didn't, so your premise was wrong. I think the premise was always that it would create new opportunities for Chinese in China. It would create a basis for maintaining peace in Asia, for avoiding conflict in Asia. And you look at the history of Asia, and that is not a small accomplishment. And frankly, it was successful by that measure. It would also lift millions of people out of poverty, which is a goal that we should seek anywhere in the world. And it frankly enhanced the growth of the global economy, and many, many American businesses and workers, et cetera, benefited from that. Others did not do as well. There are winners and losers in everything. But the notion that we did it in order to create a democracy just like us in China We did not fight for the things we needed to fight for, and we were led down the garden path by the nose. It just doesn't stand serious, detailed scrutiny of what occurred, and the archives are increasingly becoming available on those things. They deserve a serious attention. Having said that, we are not a unified actor. We're always dealing with the Congress and its permutations, with our own legal system and its application, with international obligations elsewhere and so forth. So I think there were times when we could have been tougher and we did not act tougher. And that is in administrations, both Democratic and Republican. I don't think that was systematically the case, but there are specific examples where we could have brought down the hammer more. But each time we were also looking for other things from China that were higher priority at the moment. So it's a complex history, and I think the current review of that history is just overly simplistic.
Let me ask a two-part question about the relationship between the scholarly community and Washington. What do you think have been the most important ways or ideas that have filtered from the scholarly community to Washington over the course of your career, particularly maybe in the last couple decades? And then what has the pandemic done to the ability of scholars who work on China to contribute to how Washington thinks about what's going on in China, China's role in the world, in our relationship?
Both terrific questions. One thing I learned in the government is how narrow the basis of decision-making is in terms of understanding what's going on in China. And I have always found in my own career and, among many people of my generation, at least, that probably the biggest role we played was being able to explain with credibility and in detail and in a nuanced fashion what was really going on the Chinese side, what they were trying to accomplish, what their constraints were, what their fears are, what their blind spots are, and what we really have to be worried about. And you did that by getting to know them, by being there time after time, year after year, engaging in serious research there, and also in the kinds of conversations that enable you to begin to really understand who has insight and to establish a level of trust that allows you to actually have some interesting discussions. The other part of that, of course, is explaining to them what's going on in Washington. They needed that just as much. Both sides need to be engaging in a major way over a long period of time in order to have that kind of information that they can then make available to policymakers up on the Hill in testimony or in private briefings for staff and so forth. In the administration itself, different administrations have been more or less open to different kinds of inputs, but generally speaking, scholars have been able to interact with key administration officials privately, and that's been very important. The COVID has brought that to a screeching halt. The conversations have been mostly on Zoom, except for very few exceptional folks like you who have gone over there and managed to have serious discussions in person. Really, the Zoom conversations are no substitute at all for meetings in person, for the things that happen, not with the formal talking points on panels, but actually, sitting down, chatting over meals, and that's where you really learn what you need to know. And I don't mean state secrets. I mean an understanding of so why aren't you doing that? Or what's the hope here? Or how did that happen? And then, and you can help to explain what's going on the U.S. side. So I think in both directions, scholars have a depth, a scope, and an intimacy that policymakers can't possibly bring to the table, but absolutely need to make very good policy. And I'm hoping that with the opening of China that should occur, it could get disrupted, but it likely will increasingly occur over the course of the spring and summer this year. I'm hoping that we push very hard to get scholars into China, to make it more available for Chinese scholars to come here, to do serious research as well as have conferences and that kind of thing, and to get this part of the relationship working again, because it is really crucial. It's not devoted to getting profit for a company. It's not devoted to sensationalism for newspapers. It's devoted to understanding and communicating. And that's a unique role that scholars have played in the past and can in the future.
Well, let me ask you one final question. And this has really been a fantastic discussion. I wish we could go on for a lot longer. Again, two parts connected to each other. Over the last few years, you've been watching China, like most of us, mainly from afar, may get there on the ground. As you've watched China, what are you most surprised about what you're seeing occur in China? The things that you least understand that you think we need to dig into? Or what are the kind of assumptions that we are walking around with in our heads, either as scholars or as policymakers, that need to be investigated the most, that we need to challenge the most? Essentially, what I'm asking you, what should be the agenda for big data China, for scholars, think tanks in Washington, to be most helpful to the policy community?
It's a great question. I wish I had a clear answer to it, and I don't.
Okay.
I think what has surprised me is how little we now know about what is going on in China at a high level. I've talked to some of the people in our government who really spend their careers working on those issues. And I know you have spoken to, we have the same circles of friends there. And I'm startled at how little they say they understand now about politics at the top and the dynamics of it. And yet to go from that to assuming there aren't politics, that there isn't a need to understand the flows of authority, the flows of information, who is doing briefings and what are they able to say and so forth, that's a real problem. And you can only get at that through greater accessibility, I think, by people, not SIGINT or something. You need people, and you need them there asking the right questions and developing the right relationships. I think that's really the biggest issue. I think you can explain a lot that's happened by the reality that Xi Jinping has created incentive. He's made this a personalistic dictatorship, which erodes a lot of institutional boundaries, which really has struck fear into officials at all levels, so that there's a competition kind of not to, in a nuanced way, implement policy, but rather to jump out ahead to demonstrate your loyalty and push as hard as you can to show that you're all in favor. And the logical and observable result of that is, whether it is lockdowns for COVID or now moving away from lockdowns for COVID, policy gets implemented in a hyped up way. It's very hard to get nuance. It's very hard to get local adaptation because the incentives aren't there. The incentives are to be first and foremost in demonstrating that you're on board, and that also undermines trust between officials and cooperation between officials, because they're all competing for the same thing and at each other's expense. So I think you can understand some of these dynamics from abroad, but you really need to be there to get the kind of feel that would enable you to actually be a participant, a helpful participant on both sides.
Well, my hope is that once China gets through this transition, which looks, what I would say, relatively disorderly, several months down the road, it'll be possible for scholars, think tankers, and others to resume travel again, and we will take up the agenda that you've begun to lay out for us. You've set out a large amount of work that we need to do. The two governments have a lot to do if we're going to step back from the trajectory that we're headed on as well. So you haven't left us with a lot of promise about the future, but you've given us an agenda, you've identified the challenges, and I think that's the first step towards actually making progress. So I want to thank you for joining us to get the conference started. We are going to take a short break right now and come back. And I'm going to hand things off to my partner in crime, Scott Rozelle from Stanford University, who's going to host the first panel in just a moment. So thank all of you. Just stand by. And Ken, thank you for being with us.
Pleasure. Thank you.
really much looking forward to this next session. It's a panel on what are the implications for U.S. China trade and the likelihood of future U.S. export controls and the possible retaliation measures from China, et cetera, on the industrial policy that China is trying to, or perhaps, are going to be really, looking at. We're very fortunate today to have not three of the best, the three best people who can talk to this. And I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. I'm going to ask three questions of them. We'll go through that order. They'll respond, and then we'll have some back and forth with me, and the audience will get to chime in with questions too. First of all, Loren Brandt. I've known Loren for many, many years. He's the Naranda Chair Professor of Economics at the University of Toronto and the Research Fellow at the Institute for the Study of Labor in Bonn, Germany. He co-edited a recent book, Policy, Regulation, and Innovation in China's Electricity and Telecom Industries, a book that now has lots of teeth and letting you understand what's happening. And then his very sort of seminal book, taking the analysis of China's unexpected economic boom for the first 3 decades, how it happened and where it was going. It's called China's Great Economic Transformation. It was in 2008. His current research focuses on issues of industrial upgrading, innovation in China, inequality dynamics, and economic growth and structural change. Exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Thank you, Loren, for coming. Second, Mary Lovely. She's the Anthony Solomon Senior Fellow in the Peterson Institute. She's also the Library of Congress Chair in U.S. China Relations with Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. I've tried to get that right. I hope it's pronounced right, Mary. Professor Lovely is Professor Emeritus of Economics at Syracuse University at Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Her current research projects investigate the effects of China's foreign direct investment policies on trade flows and entry mode, the relationship between proximity to export markets and cross-city wage variations, and finally, the influence of Chinese tariff reductions on labor shares and values of its manufacturing industry. So how this whole industrial sector in China is evolving and then interacting with the world. And then finally, another long time friend, Dan Rosen. Good to see you here, Dan. He's the co-founder, I think almost everybody knows this, of Rhodium Group and leads the firm's work on China. Mr. Rosen has worked professionally on China's domestic economy and global commercial relations since 1992. I think that's when I met him. He's senior associate at the Trustee Chair here at CSIS and is an adjunct associate professor at Columbia University. From 2000-2001, Dan was senior advisor for international economic policy at the White House's National Economic Council and the National Security Council. He's the member of the Council of Foreign Relations and a board member at the National Council of U.S. China Relations. Dan knows his way around these institutes. Will have a lot to say and knows what we want to hear. So let's get started, everyone. I'm gonna sort of lay out just in 3 short paragraphs the policies, the issues that we're thinking about here. It's sort of the Chinese Communist Party has long noted in policy documents that the market and the private sector have been important or even leading drivers of China's economic growth over the past 30 to 40 years. However, as we all know, in recent years, it appears that China's leaders have concluded that this expansive role of the market has also created some new risks. Evidence underpinning this, we remember the stock market crash of 2015, the environmental degradation across the country, rising inequality, excessive sways for private technology firms, and the ballooning debt of the property sector, local governments, and elsewhere. At the same time, Beijing appears to see an increasingly hostile external environment, and Ken talked a lot about that in his keynote address, that's perceived as also increasing risk. So risk from within and risk from without. The trade war with the U.S., Washington's high-tech export controls, the formation of unfriendly economic blocs, and potential sanctions resembling those imposed on Russia might appear high on this list of external threats that China perceives. In response to this risky internal and external in microenvironment, the CCP appears to have placed a new emphasis on security for sure, and perhaps, this is what I study, maybe equity in ways that reorient its private sector activity and create a larger role for the government in the economy. If this reorientation is real and does not change in the future, it would represent a real fundamental change with far and potentially probably absolutely far-reaching implications. Okay, so that's sort of what we're going to be trying to discuss here today. And I'm going to ask 3 questions, and I'm going to go to Loren, I'm going to go to Mary, and then to Dan. And then you guys can fight about them a little, and I'll follow up with a couple questions, and we'll go from there, okay? So 3 questions. Number 1, do you think security and equity, okay, these new forces have indeed eclipsed growth as the main objective of China's economic policy? I'm going to be taking notes on that. I think this is the fundamental question. And if yes, what are the implications in the near and medium range future? Based on current environment, what sectors of China's economy do you anticipate will be the most important drivers of growth in the near to medium term, if any? So, Loren, why don't you take it away, and then Mary will be next, and then on to Dan.
Okay, as usual, these are 3 great questions to get us started, and perhaps, I'm going to put on my kind of economic historian hat just a little bit. And I think that to look at these questions, we have to put them into a little bit of perspective. And so let me take each of them in turn. First, in regards to the security and equity, eclipsing growth, on the surface, it kind of looks to be this way, but I'm going to argue that it's really misleading. There's always been trade-offs. Take a look at the last 3 or 4 decades. There's always been trade-offs between economic growth and between these competing objectives of the state and the party that are tied to China's political economy. And so that an important feature, of the Chinese economy since the onset of reform has always been this kind of combination of dynamism with an awful lot of inefficiency. And that I would argue that an awful lot of the inefficiency that we've seen in the Chinese economy through the 80s and 90s all the way through today is typically a consequence of all these distortionary policies that have been used to try to achieve all of these other kind of non-economic objectives, be they strategic, security. So if we thought about the 80s and the 90s, there we saw a massive redistribution from the non-state to the state sector through the financial system that just about crashed the system. So here you can see this kind of competition again between growth and between supporting the state sector. By the late 1990s, these costs got so high, in terms of overall, that we saw a downsizing of the state sector, accompanied by fiscal as well as by financial re-centralization. These reforms were both good for growth. They basically put China again on a path that allowed it to grow relatively robustly for the next maybe 10 to 12 years. It also put an awful lot of more hands in the resources of the center to achieve all other kinds of objectives, including equity. How they decided to use those resources, on the other hand, is a totally separate matter. So first point that I'm going to make is that there's always been these tensions. They've been there from the very beginning. We see them today. Second question, well, what about the implications? Well, in order to kind of know what the implications are of these policies that we're seeing, we really need to know where the Chinese economy is. And that I would argue that the choices that China is facing today are much more difficult because of a deeper set of economic problems that they're facing. These are problems that they were facing before COVID. And so I'm just going to ignore COVID for right now. I'm going to ignore what's been going on 2020, 21, and 22. But if we kind of ignore COVID for a moment and we take a look at the Chinese economy, basically from those few years before the financial crisis up to the beginning of COVID. So I'm looking at basically a 10 or 15-year period. What we will see over that 10 to 15-year period is a marked slowdown in economic growth. And so if I factor in what I believe kind of the over-reporting in the national income accounts in terms of how rapidly the Chinese economy has been growing, I would say again that what we saw before the financial crisis to just before COVID, that we've seen an economy that's, in terms of growth, it has declined from growing at maybe 8% per year to something that's probably 4% or a little bit less again per year. So in other words, that we got an economy before COVID that is growing about half the rate of what it was before the financial crisis. Moreover, the most important reason that we see the decline again in this growth is because of the enormous drop that we see in productivity and in productivity growth. And so certainly calculations that I've done, calculations that others have done, you take a look at productivity growth before the financial crisis, it's running there about 4%. It's contributing at least half to the growth that we observe. Today, when you take a look, or before COVID, you take a look at productivity growth, it's sitting there at less than 1%. So a significant portion of the growth, the decline in growth that we happen to observe, again, over this period is because of the decline in productivity growth. It lowered growth, the productivity growth lowered growth, but it also just kind of reduced a lot of the incentives for investment in the private sector. So what's important is that this slowdown, it preceded Made in China 2025. It actually preceded, I would argue, Xi Jinping in 2012. And that, there's a good reason that today that we see all this added pressure on infrastructure investment and housing, two sectors with very low productivity, because they're trying to sustain growth in the face of this decline in productivity. Now, the sharp drop in productivity, from my perspective, is really puzzling. Go back before the financial crisis. This is an economy where per capita GDP, wages are probably 20 to 25% of what they happen to be, again, in advanced countries. If you go ahead and if you take a look at productivity, maybe 30 to 35% the levels that we happen to observe in advanced countries. What that tells us is that there was enormous potential for China to just simply leveraging, again, this gap between itself and between the rest of the world in terms of continuing, again, be able to grow at very respectable rates. Over the same period that we saw investments in human capital. We saw investments in infrastructure. We saw huge increases, again, in R&D expenditure, none of which, again, helped in that regard to try to kind of sustain the productivity growth and the growth more generally that we happen to see. Moreover, it's also interesting to note that over this period of time that we happen to be talking about, the state sector, at least as we measure it from the perspective of the national income accounts, hasn't gotten any bigger. So what's going on then? Well, I would argue that policy choices over a much longer period, so not just the last 3 years, not just since 2015, policy choices over a much longer period are the reasons, again, why we see this significant growth in productivity and growth more generally. This is an economy that has become less, not more open to FDI and competition in manufacturing and services. This is an economy that is focused on indigenous innovation. There's more top-down science and technology policy that puts a premium on leapfrogging, moving into cutting-edge, again, technologies, rather than the incremental kind of innovation at which Chinese entrepreneurs are super at. There's been limited regulatory reform in both the financial as well as in the ITC sector. Security and strategic considerations are going to enter in here, but I'm going to argue that what was driving this policy shift that I would argue, again, has relatively, again, kind of long roots, was this view that these kinds of policies that I've been describing, indigenous innovation, moving to cutting-edge technologies, being less, not more open, were policies that they thought were necessary to sustain growth and avoid the middle income trap. Perhaps the irony of this is that the policies that have been most likely to ensure the middle income trap are the policies that they implemented to avoid the middle income trap. And so kind of, Scott, then you're kind of short of major policy reversal, what I'm going to argue, this economy is going to continue to experience difficulty with kind of rising tensions of the sort you've described. Finally, last question, based on the current environment, what sectors do you expect will be the most important drivers in the near to medium term? I think there's two separate questions here that are really important. Which sectors will be prioritized and where will the growth will come from? In this current environment, I can easily see China kind of doubling down on its current strategy, its investment in all the strategic and emerging sectors that we've been talking about: AI, biotech, semiconductor, supercomputing, additive manufacturing, new energy vehicles. So all of that list that we see, if one takes a look, for example, at the most recent list that's been compiled of the kind of the key national labs, again, you can also see kind of where their technological, where their priorities are. But none of this, from my perspective, is going to help the productivity. None of it is going to help the growth anytime soon. And in this context, it's important, again, to recognize that even in the United States, that there's some serious debates that are going on amongst economists about the effect that these kinds of technologies are going to have over the long run in terms of generating kind of the productivity and the growth that we've seen, let's just say in the United States, over 100 or 125-year period. So these are general purpose technologies. Will they be effective in maintaining, sustaining productivity and growth kind of in the long run as those earlier general purpose technologies, electricity, the internet? A lot of debate out there, and lots of people who know these things much more than I do are what I would say are pessimistic. They're not overly optimistic that these things are going to be overly successful. So in China, we have these choices that to begin with may not have fit perfectly, but there's also, again, these real serious debates that are going on about how transformative these technologies are going to be. So my own sense then is that we're going to see kind of more top-down measures that will only further reduce the growth prospects, and short of some kind of major set of policy changes of the sort that we saw in the mid to late 1990s, I just kind of see China just kind of muddling along.
Got it. Good. Thank you, Loren. That's sort of the great economic transformation just extending through today, and the problems and the successes that they've had and will that be driving China from this middle income level up anymore? And let's see. I think that's that there's some problems there. Mary, why don't you take over from Loren, and what's your view on this?
Okay, thank you, Scott. It's really a pleasure to be here. Maybe I've been a good student of Loren's. I certainly have tried to read everything he writes, but I agree with him. And just a couple of points to highlight. One, that China's growth has been slower than the headline numbers, and it's been slower for some time. Secondly, that the policies that have retarded growth predate Xi, so they're longer standing responses to what China sees as its challenges. And lastly, that the policies largely reflect an anxiety about being caught in the middle income trap. I'm sure, Scott, your book didn't make anyone in Beijing very happy, just in terms of thinking about how you're warning them how difficult it is to escape the middle income trap. I think this is something that has led them to believe that intervention is the way to go, and certain types of growth enhancing policies that would promote growth, promote competition, promote transformation, really needed to be slowed down or diminished. I won't say eliminated because that's too strong a word. The prompt we were given was about security versus equality and other, I would say, more household-friendly approach. And I think it's fair to say that the West has been waiting for a very long time for the shift from export or investment-led growth to consumption-led growth. And maybe we just should keep waiting. I don't see this shift happening anytime soon. One reason why we thought it might be coming was because the costs of not shifting to consumption-led growth seem to be growing over time. We've been predicting the fact that export growth has to slow down, that investment, the types of investment that they were pursuing in property development and in infrastructure had a low return. And so throwing good money in a hole just did not seem to be the way forward, and they would have to shift to meet the needs of a population whose expectations were rising. So we've been expecting this for a long time. The factors that would underlie such a move seem to be pointing in the direction of it happening, and that, of course, would be necessary to offset what is likely to be a very hard political shift in moving resources away from local governments and into the hands of households making choices about the allocation of resources. So this would require the central government, local governments to take their hands off the wheel as to where investment would flow, and so what would be privileged in the economy and what wouldn't. as well as other dynamics that follow from a redistribution or a rebalancing of who controls the right or the power to choose what the economy makes. Households, we might expect, would also want to perhaps have a larger political voice. So there were a lot of issues in undertaking this transition. Now we see that dynamic, I think, shifting. National security, investment in national security, I think, the return to that in the view of the party has only increased. High-tech investment, clearly the U.S. has taken the gloves off in terms of starting to, remove access to its high-tech products to China. Military investment will continue, perhaps even grow. And China will continue to pursue overseas alliances, something they had, I think, pulled back on and perhaps may be accelerating again in the future. So there's a lot of reasons for them to seek alliances, to try to be strong and to try to double down on their indigenous innovation in the high-tech sector. When we turn to the household sector, we see that they have the same needs that they always had: need for economic security, need for improvements in education, as in Scott's book, need for job creation with youth unemployment high. But again, this would require a shift in power, and local governments are already strapped coming out of COVID, and they're going to be pushed to develop the indigenous investment strategy that the central government wants to see. So it's hard to see how the shifts to household empowerment will happen. So in my view, it seems that the forces that were making the pivot from investment-led growth to consumption-led growth difficult are now, if anything, even more difficult. So that leads me from a slightly different position to the same conclusion that Loren drawn, which is that they have facing major policy changes, but they're likely to double down on the same strategies. And lastly, just looking at the drivers of growth, we were asked about the drivers of growth. One would be a post-COVID consumption boom, like we saw in the US. It's possible. We don't know what the next 3 months hold for China. It's actually a pretty scary time in a lot of ways. After we get through a surge or whatever we have is coming, I hope there isn't a surge, honestly, but whatever is coming in the next 3 months, households could respond. I have serious doubts about how large a boom that would be, given that the basic insecurities that they felt still exist. And the last is whether they can double down on net exports as a source of growth. And I think that we're seeing the problems that will pose, including some of the things that Scott talked about in his preamble, such as attempts by the U.S., obviously, to route supply chains around China. Okay, I'll leave it there and turn it over to Dan.
Great. Thanks, Mary. And I think that those are very complimentary talks where, and we get, like you said, Mary, get to where both of you think China's going. They're going to use the same old tools that they used before, and is there a lot of impetus for growth through there? Dan, it's hard to be number 3 and behind these two guys, but I know you do a lot of work in similar areas, but also different. So take it away. It's your floor.
Thank you, Scott. And it's so great to be here with Loren and Mary to do this. Fantastic people and work. So I'll hunt around a little bit to see if I can come up with something additional to offer, because I very much agree with the analysis that we've heard so far. So let me first offer a prelude to addressing your 3 questions that has to do with your setup. The notion that the party sort of grew exasperated by the things that come along with the market and thus had to look for some different directions. It's kind of like blaming, saying we're going to get rid of automobiles and public buses because they cause traffic accidents. To blame environmental degradation, the 2015 stock market crash, and those other things on the market, it just doesn't really seem fair. I mean, markets are a way of finding efficiency. and the best production possibility frontier, but they need to be regulated. They require modern government institutions to make them work effectively. They're not in a jungle. We do have traffic lights and all that kind of stuff. And I think the problems China is encountering today, for example, the real estate catastrophe that they find themselves in, with this year's reduction in property sales alone equaling 4% of Chinese GDP. There's no way to fill that hole in. And it's not the market that's the problem. It was imprudent government behavior over the course of a decade since the great financial crisis. So one statist intervention to have it both ways in 2010-11 has begotten the next problem, which shouldn't be blamed on the markets. To your thesis, Scott, that is what we're seeing, a preference for security and equity over efficiency, as reflected in the absence of total factor productivity, which Loren mentioned. Indeed, I don't think so. I don't think we can say that China has acquired greater security by turning away from basic market reform work that needed to be done over the Xi Jinping years, and in particular over the past 5 or 6 years. And I agree with you, Scott. If you were not moderator, if you were a panelist, you'd be pointing out that China has not acquired greater equity for its people or a more common prosperity at all. In fact, the damage done to market mechanisms will be terribly regressive for the interests of the people. Unlike Japan in the 90s when it chose to go sideways in the name of political stability, shall we call it, China has 900 million people waiting in the wings for their turn, as you have taught us all, and I can't forget every day. And so whatever explains the change in the political economy in the past couple of years, it ain't security and equity. It's probably the elusive seduction of the idea of political stability. But as we've discovered, without growth, there is no political stability. And if we just look over the past month, the limits of the sort of political pride and ego of zero COVID, hanging on to it too long because it's what the leadership had attached itself to, gives rise to political instability, in fact. And so that allows me to sort of speak to the implications part of my initial answer to you. Any country ultimately that puts political stability, right, which is the opposite of market dynamism, it's trying to lock in market structures that exist today despite technology shocks and despite what markets are telling us about what's worth winding down and what should get more investment, right? As long as you try to stand where the leadership is effectively standing today, and we just heard an hour or two ago that the Central Economic Work Conference has been postponed due to COVID. So it's not going to take place on schedule this week or next week or what it would have been. So policymaking is not being made. None of the problems are being addressed, right? And the implication of that will be enough slowdown in growth to force a reckoning that will inevitably and ultimately cause Beijing to turn back toward getting back on track with policies that will deliver efficiency and growth. So I think it ultimately will be self-correcting. Alas, almost a decade has been lost already, or at least half a decade. To the final point, and then we'll get to discussion, what sectors will provide the growth in the future? I'll assume for purposes of answering that this reckoning is permitted to take place. And so the question is, if China gets it right and stops clogging up its own arteries with over-attachment to elusive stability, then what could generate growth? Well, we're over-invested to the tune of tens of trillions of dollars in property and other areas of heavy industry, but we're under-invested to the same magnitude in human capital investments. The healthcare and rural healthcare and education, Scott, that you spent your entire life advocating for. We have a whole new multi-trillion-dollar need to invest in environmental mitigation, climate mitigation, seawalls to avoid Shanghai slipping underwater, essentially, and becoming uninhabitable, and all sorts of other massive price tag things in the interior. And there's lots of other sectors as well that can be part of a strong story. As Loren also pointed out, this is not a country that's tapped out yet in terms of growth. Simple regression to the mean means that it's not 8% anymore, but 4% or 3% on a 17, 18, 20 trillion dollar base is the most exciting thing in the world if they let that happen. But it's not more property, and it's not more local government funded infrastructure with very low social returns. And let me stop there.
Yes. So the big reckoning, I think, what Dan says is that are they going to go back to this, to using the market to make decisions and get rid of the what Dan calls the search for political stability interventions into this market and the emphasis on these sectors of the economy that have sort of tapped out. That's the reckoning. And I think the economists, at least Dan, was a little bit more optimistic than I hear most of the political scientists around. But let's see. Open it up. Loren, do you want to talk about Mary or Dan or Mary? Why don't we just go across? Do you have anything to add to that? And then I've got a couple questions for you, and then we're going to open up for questions of the audience. Mute, unmute, Loren. Yep.
No, I think I'll hold off at this point. Look, I think that our perspectives, again, were kind of highly complementary, in that regard. And so I'll just hold off again for the moment. Don't have too much more to add.
Mary.
Yeah, I think that was absolutely fascinating. When we think about China, since, trying to stop clogging its own arteries, which I thought was just kind of a brilliant illusion, what can it do to really revive the market economy? What have been its major missteps, and what could it stop doing, or what could it start doing? So a lot of us would point to the allocation of investment, financial intermediation, getting, funds to the new sectors, new players. I think that's probably at a lot of the top of our list. But reviving productivity in the service sector is very important, given the share of GDP that services now recommend, and how they've the tremendous hit that they took during 3 years of COVID. Growing productivity in the public sector, in education, in government services, and higher education. These are problems that we struggle with in the West. So I would be very interested in what my, fellow panelists think about key areas for China to target if they're going to do that.
Yeah, Dan?
Well, just to riff off of that, which I like so much, I think what is needed is a guarantee and with a down payment that government is going to do what government needs to do, which is ensure that parties in the market will get a fair hearing if there's a disagreement about who owns what, and they need to go into court. Government will do what government needs to do, provide healthcare and education, enough for China to get through its middle income fork in the road right now. What government oughtn't do is figure out which firms, which industries should have which market share at which year in the future relative to non-Chinese businesses, which ought to be part of the Chinese marketplace as well. So if government does what it needs to do, you're not going to restore potential growth of, call it 3.5%, 4%, something like that. You're not going to do that in the next 2 or 3 years. But smart money, smart companies will crowd in or choose to stop what they're about to do, which is leave China, as Terry Gwatt Foxconn had to write to the general secretary personally and say, if you don't read my lips, if you don't stop this zero COVID craziness, we're leaving, full stop. And everybody else in my cluster of making consumer electronics will leave, right? So that can still be stopped. Whether that is stopped and China arrests this erosion of credibility, that's a $20 trillion decision. And before we even get to making super smart choices at the margin about this kind of new electric vehicle versus the battery segment, whatever, we just need to clarify whether China intends to do this rationally going forward or all according to some sort of political calculus, which market folks just aren't going to get out of bed in the morning. They're going to keep laying flat or they're going to leave.
So Scott, let me just kind of add just, 2 points there. I mean, these kinds of discussions, that we're having about kind of redefining what I'll call the role of the state, the regulatory role of the state, these are discussions that have been going on in China for a relatively long period of time. And I just kind of go back and I look at the document that preceded Made in China 2025, China, 2030. That was a lot of that, a focus of that was on regulatory reform in the state, redefining what the role of the state was. Now, I think it recognized how important that regulatory reform was because they saw that this day was coming. I mean, if you happen to have an economy where, there's huge productivity gap with you in the West, there's all kinds of gains, just kind of latent potential that's happened to be sitting there, and you got savings rates of 40 or 50%. What that implies is that you can direct, half, to really kind of dynamic sectors. You have an enormous amount of resources that you can go ahead and that you can use to try to kind of smooth over, achieve all other kinds of political economy objectives. I think that's one of the things that we forget, that this resource reallocation that we see, be it through the financial system or how the state happens to be influencing where capital happens to be going, this is achieving, again, all kinds of objectives. It's achieving all kinds of political economy objectives in that regard. And so this is just that tension that we see, and that the market is itself, as economists, we kind of believe in creative disruption. We know how messy it is. If we take a look at the set of firms today, even in the United States or in the West, there's very few, again, today that were there or that were important 20 years ago, 30 years or 40 years ago. And again, in China, it's just kind of hard to imagine that similar kind of disruption, occurring. I mean, we've seen new firms emerge, but they acquire, again, all kinds of power and interest as they go ahead and as they acquire size. So we're really talking about processes themselves, just even the economics. It's messy, but typically it has political implications as well. People's political power rests, again, on these firms, on these groups. And so as you allow that creative destruction to go ahead, it can have all kinds of implications for a political process. And I'm just not sure that this is a political system that's ready to weather those kinds of consequences of that kind of disruption.
Good. I'm going to ask a couple questions. What I'd like to remind the audience is it's time to ask these guys, and you're going to have priorities here. On the YouTube screen there's a button to ask questions live, and so it's your chance to get at these guys. And one of the questions I see that comes from them is one I'd like to direct it right back at Loren, sort of on top, push you just a little more on what you said, a little more specificity. So if China did try to sort of, sort of back off politically and let the market sort of dive in, what are the implications? Which type of domestic firms or in general domestic firms could really sort of lead with innovation, productivity, or competitiveness? What's being sort of capped off there? I know you've talked about this both in your general comments and just now. Is there anything deeper down? What would you go tell Xi Jinping with your one-on-one meeting? I probably as economic advisors would be a better meeting to have. Just unmute yourself.
Scott, my own sense is that there are lots of opportunities in lots of sectors, not only in manufacturing. Mary also highlighted services. I mean, services, again, is one of those sectors we don't talk nearly as much about, and we don't talk about it nearly as much because we can't measure it. I mean, it's a lot more difficult to measure, but clearly the kinds of gains that there are in terms of kind of reform in the service sector, that have been highlighted, and I think that maybe even Dan or Mary mentioned again a number of those in services where there's just all kinds of rooms again for improvement. But my general sense is that as I kind of take a look across industries, one of the things that sticks out to me is that when I kind of see what's happened with productivity growth, and this is maybe just a little bit more kind of on the technical side, but when you take a look at where productivity growth has been coming from, in China, a lot of it came from new firms. These new firms that were entering, these barriers to entry were coming down. China's just incredibly entrepreneurial, and I'm just a big fan, of Chinese entrepreneurs. They were identifying opportunities. They were moving into them. They were leveraging, kind of the supply chains. They were leveraging, the foreign direct investment. They were leveraging everything. They identified market opportunities, and they moved again into those areas. So these new firms were unbelievably important. What we've seen over the course of the last 10 years, that the dynamism, the contribution that these new firms are making, the kind of productivity growth, it's just disappeared. They had been at one point better than what kind of all of those existing firms are. Now that when we see these new firms that are entering, they're no better than the rest. So China has lost that source of dynamism and productivity growth. The exact reasons for it, again, are not exactly clear. Is it because there were these kind of one-time gains that they exhausted as they lowered these barriers? Or is there something much more systematic, again, that's going on that makes it extremely difficult for entrepreneurs to be able to go ahead and to enter, again, a lot of these industries, again, where we see new opportunities emerging? The other important point that when you look at kind of the productivity growth is that one of the things that you do not observe is the best of the firms getting bigger. If you take a look at a country like the United States or Europe, a lot of the productivity growth is coming because resources and market share are being reallocated to those very, very good firms. That's probably the source in the United States of 50 to 60% of the productivity growth. You look at it in the context of China, that's just not happening. That's just not contributing. So there's something there about the nature of the market environment and certain sectors, again, that I've looked at over time. And I talk to these entrepreneurs. I say, well, look, why don't you make these investments that are going to allow you to upgrade, move again into kind of more demanding kinds of sectors? And what they say, hey, look, these investments are huge. I'm really uncertain about the market opportunity. I'm uncertain if I make all of these investments, if I'm going to, in some sense, be treated fairly by the market. So there's an awful lot of impediments that are kind of out there in terms of how the market happens to work. It gets to a regulatory question that, again, are going to be, in some sense, kind of undermining the incentives that lots of these entrepreneurs have to be willing to go ahead and to make huge, huge investments. Now, if you take a look at a sector like EVs, what I really like about EVs now is that this is a sector that, unlike, kind of the internal combustion engine auto sector, that was a sector that was unbelievably restricted in terms of who could enter. If you were a multinational, you had to enter by a JV. If you were a private sector firm, good luck trying to get a license, at least, up until recently. In terms of licensing agreements, very difficult, again, to kind of license technology. What we observe in EV today is, there's lots of firms, and that we see firms basically kind of in every kind of market segment. We can see the high end kind of, EV manufacturers. We see it in Tesla. We see it in some of those Chinese companies. But what we've also seen emerge is some lower end EV manufacturers in China that are finding market, that are providing, again, sources of demand for battery manufacturers, kind of medium sized battery manufacturers. This is exactly the kind of dynamic that we've seen in other contexts that ultimately contributes to a really dynamic, growing industry. And so what I would say that there's lots of opportunity out there, but a lot of it has to do with this framework, the regulatory environment in which these firms happen to be operating. If you can figure out ways to go ahead and to reform that environment, I guarantee you that you'll see exactly the kinds of results that you're looking for.
Yeah, I agree. I just know a story of that I've had given to me by an investor who took a very what he thought was a new technology that had lots of potential to the biggest companies in China to try to get them, and they basically said, we're lying flat these days. We do not think we should even move into these new sectors because there's so much uncertainty. It's exactly what you said, but there's that potential there, and I think that was very good. Mary, you can add on to that, or there's a question about the implications for U.S. China trade and likelihood of future export controls. Are there going to be retaliatory measures back from China? Is this going to sort of hold back this potential that Loren says, I think we all know is out there? What are some of your ideas on that?
Well, let me just pick up on one of the last words that Loren used, which is uncertainty. The U.S. actions are adding more uncertainty to not only where Chinese firms should invest, but also where U.S. firms should invest. We see firms reaching out to, they're even reading the word academics, trying to figure out what is going on. Where is the U.S. government going to go next? What investments are safe? Am I secure operating in China? Am I secure exporting from China to other locations? Am I secure even importing from third countries that use inputs from China. So I think we've seen government actions on both sides raise uncertainty for firms. I think we know that the relationship has largely been on a downward trajectory. And despite the recent meeting between President Xi and President Biden in Bali, I don't think we have any more certainty that downward slide will be stopped. We know that there's little political will in the U.S. to adjust the trade war tariffs, unfortunately. There's certainly more national security minded export controls coming down the pike in the U.S. The U.S. is really beginning to pick up speed and focus attention on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And with that comes a lot of job owning and perhaps investment, some investment leveraging by the U.S. to move supply chains away from China. So we have the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, for example, going to India, talking about the U.S. loan guarantees for First Solar, loans to First Solar, and then, of course, talking a lot about friendshoring. And I think the Indians have clearly gotten the message. So, so far we don't really see what it means when President Biden says we're not seeking decoupling. On the Chinese side, of course, we haven't had much help in terms of making the case that they're moving away from things that the U.S. objects to. So we're continuing to see that. I think Loren said that a lot of the seeds for what's happening now were planted right after the global financial crisis. That goes back a long way. I think we're seeing a lot of seeds that came out of Chinese industrial policy. For example, we know that in solar, China was rapidly gaining market share at a time when it basically was doing no domestic installations, which makes this industrial policy basically an export subsidy. And the U.S. did not respond, and we're still mad about it. And so now we're doing industrial policy on a whole bunch of things. So I think we see the seeds of this have been planted a long time ago. And it does not seem to me that in terms of U.S.-China relations, that we have hit the bottom yet.
Thank you, Mary. It's very, very useful. I have one more set of questions that comes from, I'm not going to say who, it's a very, a person that you would all know. And I'll ask Dan this, but the others can pipe in. Cook, we're going to try to wrap this up in the next 5 minutes or so. What are your views of two groups of people in China relevant to this future economic trajectory? Chinese technocrats in government, have they lost their influence? And Chinese economists, do they have any seat at the policy table? Is anyone listening? Are they? Can they be dragged in, or are they there already and not listening? What do you think about that Dan? Is that something you can talk to, I'll final comments, and then we'll wrap up.
I mean, none of the economists I know would like to be associated with the policy outcomes of the past five years or so. So they would probably say, yeah, no, I haven't been able to get my memos read, I guess. But look, I mean, there are technocrats, right? That's the term we use for folks like Liu He, Luo Jiwei, many people over the years who they passed our smell test for whether they could have a coherent, internally consistent conversation about a policy package that would be fit to the observed evidence of performance and potential in the economy, in the Chinese economy. And their ideas ended up being reflected in policy, right? And giving rise to productivity and growth and things that we could measure and see that were proof that stuff works. And so we know they existed, for starters. There's a certain school of thought right now that they were always a sort of an illusion, a set of ghosts stood up by the Ministry of State Security, right? And that we kidded ourselves into believing that even was a part of the Chinese political economy and system. That's not true. They were real. They are real. And I love to point out, I love to argue that if we look at the Xi Jinping years, the first half of it was chock-a-block with efforts to take the next step in implementing marketization reform work, cleaning up the shadow banking system, center local fiscal reform, lowering the capital account to allow Chinese firms to go global, starting to internationalize the renminbi. Ultimately, even years later, the red lines in property. These were all, constructed out of a clear diagnosis of what the nature of the economic problem was. And this was 2012 through 2016, introducing independent boards of director participation at state-owned enterprises to improve governance outcomes, right? The 2013 60 decisions that Xi Jinping and Liu He, introduced at the very beginning. All those things had the right stuff. And we know that it wasn't just smoke and mirrors because they tried to implement all those things. But we also know that by 2016 or so, all of them had shown that they would cause so much political rattling and instability that it was going to be very uncomfortable to follow through and finish the job. And in all of those areas, they pulled back once they realized how destabilizing these policies to push through the middle income level were going to be. So it's still in the mix. Every now and then over the past couple, and then beyond that point, beyond 2016, the central tendency is to go out and try to find some magic third way that would avoid any political instability while still getting Loren his productivity back. And guess what? I mean, the hard lesson for the rest of us in the 20th century was you can't have it both ways. You can't both have the horse and buggy industry not annoyed at you and create a new internal combustion engine industry. Something's got to give. There's going to be losers. China, 1978 to 2012, was willing to wrestle with the hard stuff of structural adjustment and losers. Lately, not willing to do so, too scared about the political risks entailed in trying to follow that course. And so technocrats are there if they are allowed the power and authority to implement these painful adjustment policies where not everybody wins, then they will, be part of the solution. Otherwise, right now, they certainly can't come out of the shadows comfortably and play that role.
Dan, Loren, Mary, we're at time now. I think what I took away from this is that all three of the panelists have this sort of same idea that this isn't a last 5-year rise out of the new administration as we call it, but it's part of the system that's trying to put together that created a lot of growth early. But, as it starts to mature as a big economy, there's trade-offs that have to be made. And some of them are painful. They don't allow that pain to happen, to trade off the horse and buggies for the internal combustion engine. I actually really, I see that everywhere. And I think that it forms the basis of the problems that the panelists have sort of said China is facing, and that's put us where we are today. Thank you guys very, very much. I think it was a great compliment to Ken's opening speech, and it's going to be the foundation for panel number 2 that's coming up in 5 minutes, where it says 12:30, it's going to be 12:35. It's on COVID-19 policy impacts and exit strategies, and no one could have prepared for this session if they prepared their speech 2 weeks ago. And I have 6 friends with COVID right now in China, in 5 different cities. So it's a lot there. We're going to take a 5-minute break. The next panel is hosted by Ilaria Mazzacco, who runs Big Data China program for us, administrates it, along with Scott Kennedy. Thank you very much. We'll see you guys all soon.
Good afternoon. My name is Ilaria Mazzocco. I'm a senior fellow in the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at CSIS, and I am delighted to welcome you to the second panel of the first annual Big Data China Conference. I'm excited today to be joined by an outstanding panel of experts to discuss the path forward for China as it moves away from a strict zero COVID policy. Before I introduce our panelists, and I talk more about the panel's topic, I just wanted to take a moment to mention some housekeeping items. We will be taking audience questions in the second half of the panel. So if you do have questions, and we do encourage you to submit your questions, please submit them through the event page on csis.org or bigdatachina.csis.org. You should be able to see it on the event page where you may also be viewing this. There should be a button right there. So we look forward to getting many questions on this exciting topic. And then the other quick note is that this is panel number 2 of our conference, and there is a panel following this one. So do stay tuned after we're done to watch the next discussion. So zero COVID, when we thought about this panel weeks ago, we had no idea the situation would be so dynamic. As people may know, it's over the almost past 3 years, China's pursued a strict policy to control COVID, which entails rolling lockdowns of neighborhood cities, strict testing policies, a variety of apps and phones to help with contact tracing, and then quarantine centers for those infected or exposed to infection. There seemed to be very few signs that this was changing or that the officials were considering different types of exit strategies. And then in the past 3 weeks, everything started changing very, very quickly. So it's actually become very challenging to track all the different changes. There was a tragic, deadly fire that took place on November 24th in Urumqi, which led to protests. And then after that, we saw protests breaking out throughout the country, notably in Shanghai and Beijing. And although those protests have ended, they seem to have mostly ended by the beginning of December. Last weekend, we saw a relaxation of central government policies and a profusion of local government policies aimed at reopening. So there's still huge differences in regulation across regions in China, which is contributing to a certain level of confusion for observers, but also very differences in how people are experiencing this moment in China. So infection rates do seem to be soaring in some areas, and there's some concern that this will put some pressure on the healthcare system in China. China's vaccination rates, we should note, are actually quite high at 91%, but there are some concerns about low booster rates among the elderly and the effectiveness of the vaccines that are most widely available in China. So this is the background, but today I'm delighted to be joined by some experts that can actually help us make light and understand better the situation. So we have today, I'm delighted to introduce Wenhong Chen, who is an associate professor of media studies and sociology. She is the founding co-director of the Center for Entertainment and Media Studies and a distinguished scholar in the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the University of Texas at Austin. She was a visiting fellow at the East-West Center and the Kissinger Institute at the Wilson Center. Dr. Chen's research focuses on digital media technologies in entrepreneurial and organizational settings. Her current project examines how the U.S. and Chinese AI policies affect tech and media entrepreneurship, and she has been looking closely at the codes, the health codes used in China to help implement zero COVID policies. Then we have Yanzhong Huang, who is a senior fellow for global health at the Center for Foreign Relations, where he directs the Global Health Governance Roundtable Series. He is also professor and director of global health studies at Seton Hall University School of Diplomacy and International Relations. Dr. Huang is the founding editor of Global Health Governance, the scholarly journal for the new health security paradigm. He is the author of Governing Health in Contemporary China and Toxic Politics, China's Environmental Health Crisis and its Challenges to the Chinese State. And finally, we have Win Yip, the professor of the Practice of Global Health Policy and Economics at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She serves as the faculty director of the China Health Partnership and recently completed her appointment as acting director of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. Dr. Yip was previously a professor of health policy and economics at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford. Her research focuses on policy-relevant health system evaluations and the design and testing of innovative interventions for equitable access to quality healthcare. And I should note I think there are some technical issues, so Professor Yip will be joining us via phone. So even though you don't see her image, she is here and should be able to join the conversation. So welcome to everyone. I wanted to start with a very broad question, but I think is a question that everybody has on their mind, right? And that is, how should we understand the sudden change in policy direction, or at least apparently sudden, that we've seen in the past few weeks? What do you make of the current situation, especially, given your own area of expertise? How do you approach this? What do you make of it? And what do you think it tells us about the approach that we're seeing in China and the governance and the leadership and how they're seeing this? So maybe we can start with Yanzhong.
Oh, thank you, Ilaria. Well, thanks for the invitation to participate in this panel. I think this is a very interesting moment to examine what is happening in China, right? You saw essentially this sea change, right? The policy pendulum, from one extreme to another, right? Just the last month, right? You're seeing how it was strictly sticking to the zero COVID policy, right? By launching the mass PCR testing, close contact tracing, quarantine was still busy by building makeshift hospitals, right? Then the quarantine, people, right? But now we're seeing most of those key components of zero COVID, right? They're being essentially scrapped, right? There's no longer any mandatory mass PCR testing. They no longer check your health, codes, for whether you are infected or not, right? There's you are not allowed to be home quarantined, right? Governments are not authorized to impose any snap lockdowns at will, right? So this is really, right, this significant change. I think, while I think social protest last month, actually the end of last month, may explain why this policy change happened in early December in terms of timing. But there's certainly other factors were at work, right? That there's mounting pressures, right, including economic lockdown, the social discontent. But the equally important, right, is just that zero COVID is no longer sustainable, right? You talk about, right, that just the last month, I was looking at the government data, right? The confirmed cases saw an increase of 24% in 1 month compared to all the previous months combined, right? But if you look at the people who were sent to the quarantine centers, it was 1.5 million people. That was like 247% increase, but in 1 month over all the previous months since January 2020. You could imagine how the local government would face this funding challenges, right, to just quarantine that many people, right? So I think with the spread of Omicron variant, it's just simply, right, impossible for the local governments to continue that approach. While in the meantime, containing, right, the spread of the virus is becoming a mission impossible. So I think when we are accounting for the policy shift, right, earlier this month, I think these are the factors we should keep in mind. I stop there. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you for that. I mean, absolutely. I think we were all, especially those of us who look at China's economy, we're all looking at those factors and wondering, how long can they keep going? And it just seems like maybe this was the moment where a lot of those motivations, converged and led to this very rapid change. Wenhong, how do you see it from your perspective?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's such a great honor to be part of this panel, which is so timely. And as you just pointed out, things really change and evolve very fast right now in China. So I will start with an anecdote. So just probably a week ago, I talked with one of my research assistants about to conduct another survey about the health code app in China. And we did a survey just ahead of the Chinese New Year, 2021, and almost a year after the breakout of COVID cases in Wuhan, in the city of Wuhan, as well as in the city of Hangzhou, to study how people use health code app, what their experience, their privacy concerns, their trust in government institutions and non-government institutions, their use of digital media, other type of media, as well as their imagination about a post-pandemic future. And we are thinking, okay, right now, probably another time to conduct a second round of our survey to learn more. And then the next day, I saw the news, the new 10 articles, basically almost a U-turn of China's zero COVID policy. And then farewell health code app become the #1 Weibo hot topics. And there are all these photos of janitors across the country pulling off the health code app posters in public spaces, in subway, in entrance of public buildings. And I was thinking, wow, on the one hand, I feel what an awesome opportunity for us. We should conduct our survey probably a little bit earlier. And then this joy and happiness, right? It's almost 3 years that many people in China have to use health code app to travel, to enter public spaces, to return to their neighborhood. So on the one hand, I think many people are happy to see the changes. On the other hand, for us, many of us who have families and friends are living in China, and right now is also a very, very anxious time. For instance, many of my friends, including family members in Beijing, now they got COVID. And many people have fevers, coughing, all these syndromes, and worrying whether they should go to the hospital or not. And obviously, this is just the start. And there are several months to go for China to ride this COVID pandemic and many uncertainties. And as Yanzhong just pointed out, why this sudden almost 180 change? Why China abandoned zero COVID policy? I don't think we can actually pin down to one single variable or one single factors. For me, I think the fatigue among the population about constant testing, as well as these increasing concerns and the fear among the population to be sent to isolation facility. In many facilities, like there are now medical treatment and the conditions were not really good for people. So there's that. And second, I think the protest, the white paper movement started by college students and joined by young people across the country, actually help the government to speed up about their reconsideration of the COVID policy. And the third, I think one important factor in this picture is Foxconn workers' protest in Zhengzhou, and which attract a lot of international media attention and raise the question whether China will remain a reliable production center for the global supply chain. And I think that also pushed the government to have some accelerated decision-making to change the course. Of course, many people will also point to the World Cup, right? When many people in China see how the audience, the spectators in Qatar enjoy the game without official mask. Tens of thousands of people sitting in the stadiums, and that's really increase the sense of missing out, as well as this desire to return back to normal life. So I think all these factors come together to bring us where we are right now.
Thank you for that. That is, you mentioned very many things that I do want to then ask Winnie, especially now that you're talking about soaring infections and the pressure on the healthcare system. But also, I think it's worth remembering that although we have seen extraordinarily high compliance on the part of the Chinese population with these rules, also sacrifice to maintain sort of low contagion rates, that may have come with a very high level of fatigue, which may have not been as visible until now. And then it just sort of, as I said, a convergence of different issues, and it sort of exploded in some ways, right? And now we're seeing just how happy many people are to move away from some of these restrictions. Winnie, if you can hear me, would you be able to comment and see, from your perspective, in your area of expertise, how do you interpret the last few weeks and the developments in terms of China's COVID policy? I can't hear Winnie, so maybe we'll move on. If there's, are you muted, Winnie? Guess we'll move on and see if there's a technical issue.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, we can hear you now. Great. We can hear you.
Okay. I apologize for the tech problem, which only happened on my end 15 minutes before the start time, and I can't fix it. So I have to connect by phone, but I could hear everything that you and the other panelists have said. I actually think that China was already developing a plan to transition from the zero COVID policy to another policy. But that timeline might have been a bit slower than what people can put up with. And so this is we're looking at a sort of a speeding up of what might have been in their mind, taking a little longer to implement. So I've said in multiple cases situations that I think that China have already recognized that Omicron is a different variant. It is more infectious, but it is less severe. And the infection rate just makes zero infection as a policy impossible to achieve. And so it is needed both scientifically and for people's livelihood to gradually transition to a different goal That is, accepting that people will be infected, but the goal is really to reduce the probability of mortality and also serious cases that require hospitalization. And that really has to be vaccine. There's no other solution but vaccine. And also vaccine with the effective kind of vaccine. And which means that if China continues to use Sinovac, it means 3 doses at a minimum. And so China is really playing catch up, especially with the older population, the population that has underlying conditions that previously, for a number of reasons, were not fully vaccinated. And that will take a month or 2 at least to catch up. And so it would be more advisable to open up and loosen these restrictions rather than making it a national policy, to make it a phased policy that a condition on the population's vaccination rate and also condition on the local health system capacity to deal with serious cases. Again, I want to switch the conversation from infection to serious cases. So yes, like the other 2 panelists have said, even just our friends, our colleagues, many of them are infected but mild. So that's not important. What I am not getting enough information, but am more concerned maybe are the rural area where we are paying less attention to. And because I did a lot of work of my research is in rural area, I understand that the reported infection cases are not as high as in urban area. But in those places, if there is a surge, then the local capacity to deal with it would be more difficult. In big cities, I'm actually not as worried. There is capacity. The question is whether the management of the hospital can actually pivot fast enough to have a different management strategy so that it would triage carefully and not hospitalize a large number of cases that actually doesn't need to be hospitalized. And I'm not talking about just COVID. I'm just talking about in general. So those are my several key points just to kick off the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for the reminder that, the infections themselves are not necessarily the issue. The issue is serious cases, of hospitalization and such. And actually, just staying with you, Winnie, and moving on to the next follow-up question, I think the other thing that is on everybody's mind is, what next? What's the next steps and what is the pathway in the next few months? And so you mentioned a little bit what some of the options are and some of what the risks are, but if you could elaborate a little more. I mean, you mentioned that you think that there was a plan, because I think many observers have been surprised by the lack of coordination, or apparently lack of coordination. But I think in some ways we know that China often does things in a sort of delocalized way where provinces and cities are given a certain amount of freedom to operate differently. So do you think that's what we're seeing now? Or do you think that maybe because of how quickly things have developed, that some of the plan has gotten derailed and it's going to take some time to sort of get back onto a pathway? And what do you think some of the scenarios are in the coming weeks and months?
I want to clarify. I didn't say there is a plan. What I want to say is, if I have been unclear, is my sense is that the Chinese government is working towards a plan to open up and to change from the zero COVID policy, but it's working faster now, because I do think that the decision, of course, there are 2 parts of it. One is the technical part. The other part is more of a political part. I think there's a group of technical experts who actually have looked at the situation and have given quite serious thoughts on how to gradually open up. And what is going to unfold in the coming months, I think all of us is just speculating. There's no question with the protests, with Chinese New Year, with people wanting to go home after several years, everything from a social perspective a social pressure perspective and then the economy are all pushing the government to be doing the opening and the giving up of the zero COVID policy on a fast track. And so we will be expecting a surge. And then the question is whether that is synchronized with catching up with the vaccine for the older people and also for people who are living in nursing homes, sort of close quarter, that are most likely to be getting serious infection. I cannot predict 100%, but if you read through the documents, through the lines, I do think that the government know very well that's the group of people they're targeting to vaccinate. And I do think that whether they can successfully do that is going to determine on the scenario that we're seeing. Otherwise, yes, we'll see a huge surge of infection. I noticed that the last 2 days, China is giving up the health code very quickly. I am of the view that the health code on its own at this point for Omicron may not be the most effective. It was effective earlier on for the other version and before we had vaccine. But I do think that some sort of vaccine passport will be useful in limiting entrance and mobility to public spaces with close contact. That's my speculation, I can only say.
Thank you for that. And that would be similar to what many European countries have done or did at this stage. I was just in Europe actually, and there is no more passport, no more vaccine passport app used at all. But up until earlier this year, it was still in place. Well, let's go back in the same order. So Wenhong, what about you? Where do you see? And I think many people were surprised that the health apps were discarded so quickly, right? There were a lot of predictions that this was a new form of social control, that we were going to see them for a very long time, etc. And then very suddenly there was this reversal. So what are you looking at? What are your predictions?
Thank you very much for this question. So I actually want to respond to Winnie's comments about Health Code app, like a very powerful tool, in particular in the early days of the pandemic, back in February all the way to spring 2020. When China was seriously challenged by the outbreak of COVID. And the Health Code app has been a public-private partnership, local government, first the Hangzhou city government, and then Shenzhen city government work with top Chinese tech companies, Alibaba and Tencent, respectively, to develop Health Code app so that they can trace and track positive cases, close contacts, so that they can have people go back to work and to also control positive cases for quarantine. But the Health Code app on itself is not a treatment, right? It's more about the control of population mobility to slow down or even stop the diffusion of virus. And of course, now almost 3 years from the first introduction of Health Code apps, we can learn a lot about how digital technologies has and will play a role in Chinese society during and after the pandemic. For instance, Health Code app really legitimize broad state and corporate surveillance. Right? We know that the Health Code app has other users to provide their personal information, is tied with citizens' national ID numbers. And there are also spatial and temporal data aided through telecom data. Then there are also vaccination as well as testing data aided. And according to our survey back in 2021, the big majority of our survey respondents would support expensive or moderate health code app use even after the pandemic. Only a very, very small percentage of our survey respondents would say that we should narrow down, limit the health code app use, or even terminate health code app use after the pandemic. Of course, it was back in 2021, right? And the situation has really changed so dramatically. And I wonder if we actually conducted our survey for the second round, what would be the result? How people will imagine the future of health code app post-pandemic. But I also want to point out health code app is not just an app. It's not just used for the pandemic. It's one important integral part of China's digital infrastructure. And the data are there, and the technologies are there. And over the last 3 years, the government, in particular local government, invested heavily in the technology as well as train personnel to work with the technology. So even we don't now have this so-called travel code or travel card from telecom anymore. And right now, people do not need to check their health code app anymore if they travel across cities or if they need to enter public transit or public space. But we know the technology remains. And the health code app also highlights a lot of privacy concerns, as well as this dual nature of personal data as personal as well as public. It's become an important part of public goods, right? And so next time when a pandemic happens, or when any emergency happen, how data will be used, right? There's this open question there. And also, I think health code app as technology really shows many of the challenges and the contradictions in contemporary Chinese society, right? The collaboration, but also competition between the government and the big tech, who has the ownership of data and who should benefit from using such data, as well as the, I would say, the differences between the central government and the local government. Right, we know the technology is there, but even today, there's not one single health code app in whole China. Right, there are provincial level health code app, although the technology follow national standard, but there's not one unified national health code app. And I don't think we are going to have that anytime soon. One thing I think most scholars and observers are pretty certain. Maybe we don't have something called health code app anymore, but the technology will go into public health. that's already part of a national public health policy to develop a health code for all citizens, so they can use that for their health care and health insurance payment.
Well, thank you. That's really interesting and really important. And I think actually I will just do a quick plug for a feature that we did for Big Data China back in July, looking at China's surveillance system, right? Because I think there's a question of the health app per se, and then the surveillance question in China, which is much broader, and it's a much broader infrastructure. And maybe, one app is not actually what will make it the difference, right? There's a much broader infrastructure, but that's very interesting to think about how these codes may have an afterlife in the healthcare system in China, and we may see them in a different form in the future as well. So thank you for that, and for the your predictions on what we should be taking a look at. And also the provincial level, I think for anybody who's familiar with China, of course, that's nothing new, right? The difference between local governments, central governments, and maybe even lack of coordination at some time in some moments. Yanzhong, what do you see as the outlook for the next few weeks and months? And also, if I may, just slip in one of my questions, because we are, I'm mindful of time. I'll slip in another question there, which is, what do you see a role for any U.S. China cooperation on health in this, in this moment, in this very crucial moment?
Well, thank you for the questions. So, well, certainly, right, this is sort of full of uncertainties, it's very hard to predict what will happen in the coming months, I would say. There's some people, right, predicted that for most of the Chinese major cities, the viral wave will peak around mid-January. But, just today I saw the social media post, basically say, according to anonymous internet survey of 160,000 residents in Beijing already, 1/3 of the residents likely are infected. So that seems to be much quicker, right, than we thought, right? So basically, if the trend continue, we're likely going to see, right, that the peak arrived much early, right, even before January, and so of course, but it's windy, and as already touched upon this, is whether, right, the government has the capacity, right, to withstand this viral wave. I think, currently, right, I think there seems to be mainly focused on enforcing triage procedures, right, basically, right, discouraging people, the mild cases, the not showing symptoms, from visiting the hospitals, right? But I think, as Wendy has indicated, right, when the Spring Festival is coming, right, you're going to see, right, those people from more than 200 million, right, will be moving around in the country. That also means the virus is going to travel with them. And so the countryside, even though we know, right, that this pandemic is pretty much still an urban phenomenon in China, but it's going to spread to the countryside. And as we know, right, in the countryside, they have a very fragile healthcare system. So many of those people are likely, in my opinion, right, bypass by those rural healthcare institutions to seek care in urban, major urban health centers. That is going to actually put more stress, on the healthcare system in the urban areas. I think, as Wenhong also indicated, this is not just about, we're talking about, right, those infected people, right? It's also about whether people could have access to run-of-the-mill healthcare, right? For those, cancer patients, right? They will, that now there's already reports they have difficulty of receiving the chemo, in the hospitals because of this. The healthcare system is now nearly overwhelmed. They are also trying to increase the vaccination rate among the elderly population. Wendy is a bit more optimistic on that. It takes 1 to 2 months, to significantly increase the vaccination rate. But based on the history of the vaccination campaign, it typically takes China at least 4 months to deliver a round of the vaccination, to its vast population. So we hope for this time, maybe they can accelerate the process, and hopefully they also use the more effective vaccines. And it's there we found this U.S. China cooperation could be more important than ever now, right? I think U.S. and China should seriously, they consider now sit down and start a dialogue, and that the U.S. could offer by the Chinese these bivalent, Omicron specific vaccines, with a good price, so that a large percentage of the population could have access to the vaccines. They could also offer the Chinese, the China, the more effective, antiviral drugs like Paxlovid. I just saw today, the internet pharmacy in China already start this Paxlovid is offered for pre-sale in the Chinese online store, but which a high price, and is not covered by health insurance. I think again here the U.S. Government could do something. They could buy the drugs from the companies, and then donate it to the Chinese side. I'm talking about not too many, 21 million doses, just to cover those the at-risk population. I mean, people aged over 80. That would be really something that could help China to fight this coming new this viral wave, flatten the curve, in my opinion.
Thank you. And that actually answers partially some of the questions from the public, because there were some questions on the mRNA vaccine and the Chinese the vaccines, the Chinese homegrown vaccines. So I think that's good. And I'm actually, in the interest of time, I'm just going to combine a couple of other questions that we received. So one has to do with clear communication strategies by public health officials. So why does it matter? How do you evaluate China's current strategies? Are there other countries that China might look at to learn more? And then the other question, which you may be able to answer as well, is looking at whether there's other lessons from other countries in general that China can learn from when opening up, right? Because it feels to a certain extent like some of these issues, like managing triage, et cetera, these were things that a lot of countries were grappling with back in 2020, and they were developing strategies on how to approach this. And then, of course, more closer to China is the experience of Hong Kong when we had a lot of rising infections there. So, two different questions, but maybe if I'll let you guys decide who wants to take which one and how do you want to answer them. Winnie, do you have any thoughts?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I think if you look around the world, there are only a few strategies, right? I think I am repeating myself that vaccine with the right kind of vaccine, targeting the high-risk people, and also adopt vaccine passport in the beginning. And my feeling for the health system capacity, China might have a more difficult time in adopting the triage system, actually, because hospitals have an incentive to really keep patients in the hospital for big problem or small problem. So it's not a national policy that can change that immediately. So is there going to be friction in implementing that? I don't know. The national policy is clear to try to triage, but how well can they implement it? I don't know. And on the people side, as I said in other circumstances, other situations, China does need to mount some very effective public education campaign, letting people know the importance of vaccine, letting people know that for minor problem, please don't go to the hospital, because hospital is the most dangerous place if you think about infection. And it does take changing people's mind. But I'm of the view, given the 27 years of work that I have done in China, if the government sets its mind to do it, and with the right messaging, I do think that the public will align. That's my hopeful note.
Thank you. That's helpful. Wenhong, do you have any thoughts?
Yes. I'm thinking about social media and digital technology again, as well as the Chinese diaspora. Like in the last several days, I saw many people share their COVID experience outside of China, telling people in the mainland, don't panic. The current variant of Omicron may be very infectious, but not that deadly. And these are the common symptoms people may have. And these are, the days you may need to recover. And if not syndrome, not too bad, maybe you want to stay at home. So I do see that the people share those experiences through social media. And I do see that at least in big cities like Beijing and Shanghai or Guangzhou, like the population are listening to the advice from doctors, public health experts, or maybe their friends. Like you do not see long lines outside of hospitals, probably in the first couple of days, and now become so much shorter because the hospitals start to provide online diagnose, online inquiry, delivering medicines through internet. But I do share concerns shared by Vinny and Yanzhong as COVID expand to less developed regions, in particularly to rural area, and the challenge may become much more serious, both because of underdeveloped public health services, but also many people may do not have the kind of information or social support to help them. Because we do know that in some rural areas, the population has become predominantly senior citizens, taking care of their grandchildren when their parents are working in big cities. So I hope the government will start a public health campaign very soon to communicate. I think they are already doing that. Communicating to the population the importance of getting vaccinated and not panic, and the advice they can use to monitor their situation.
Thank you. So Yanzhong, we've heard better communication via social media or public campaigns to tell people to vaccinate, to tell people to not rush to the hospital unless it's necessary. Better figuring out ways of making the triage work, even though it may not be the way in which hospitals are incentivized to work. Do you agree? And do you have any other thoughts on things that could be done?
Well, yeah, I agree on all this. The suggestions, but I think the challenge here, of course, in this messy right, events-driven, go-go environment, the local governments may not have the time, the money, right, to pursue some of those measures like vaccine, increasing vaccine uptake, investment in research capacity building. I think it's just right, they might not have the time to complete, right, there's the required the work before overwhelmed by the search of the cases. So they're really facing this narrowed choice set in terms of policy making. But on the silver lining on the cloud is that I think because as Winnie suggested last time in our pre-call, the China is so large, so heterogeneous. We're not expecting, right, this viral wave, the peak time, occurred at the same time, right? So Beijing, might the peak, or the viral wave peaked might be mid-January, but in Shanghai, it might be in early January, right? So that allow the government, to use its strong mobilization capacity to mobilize healthcare resources, personnel to support one locality when the system is, stressed out, or overwhelmed. But when the situation is stabilized, right, that they could then mobilize or reallocate the resources, for supporting other areas. So I think the situation may not be as bad as we thought.
Well, let's hope the situation is not as bad as we thought, but I think I could keep talking for another hour. I've learned so much. I had no doubt I was going to learn a lot, but it's been really enlightening and very exciting to think of the possibilities, as well as very scary, right, for the lives of many. So I'm sure I will stay in touch with you all, because I want to keep hearing your thoughts on where as China moves forward with this challenge. And I hope the public enjoyed this as well. I encourage watchers to stay online. After a very short break, the next panel on U.S. China relations, hosted by Scott Kennedy, will be coming online. The same link. And thank you so much to everyone for your insights. Thank you to Wenhong, Yanzhong, and Winnie, and thank you for the public for your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the first annual Big Data China conference that we're co-hosting between CSIS, the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics, and Stanford University's Center for Chinese Economy and Institutions. This is the final panel of the day, and we could not have a better group of world-class experts to lead us to the finish line. And we're going to be talking about U.S. China relations and whether or not we can establish some guardrails around the relationship. Guardrails might be the word of 2022, and we're going to find out whether it's going to be the word of 2023. To help us understand where the relationship is going, we are lucky to have three amazing folks with us. Let me briefly introduce them, and then I've got a question to get the ball rolling for each of them, and then we're going to have the audience weigh in. You can, at csis.org, the page for this conference, submit questions, which will come to me, and I will then ask our panelists. First, Jan Barris. She is the Vice President of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and she's been with the committee since 1971. Which is a few years, but she has walked with U.S. China relations for every step of the way. Her responsibilities include preparing and managing operations for the visits to the United States of Chinese delegations, including the 1972 Chinese ping pong team. She has also sent hundreds of American delegations to China, and she has traveled to China almost 200 times since 1973. You can count me amongst those who she has arranged travel for or meetings with visitors from China as part of the National Committee's Public Intellectuals program. John Holden is Senior Associate with the Trustee Chair, non-resident, but his day job is Managing Director and Head of China Practice for McLarty Associates. For over 4 decades, he managed China businesses for leading firms, including Cargill and Hill & Knowlton. And he was chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in China and president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and then founding associate dean of the Yenjing Academy of Peking University. I do believe, if my memory holds, that John went to Stanford University, so things are coming full circle. Finally, Elizabeth Economy is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, also at Stanford University. I think there's a theme today. She is currently on leave to serve as senior advisor for China to the Secretary of Commerce. Previously, she was CV Star Senior Fellow and Director for Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's an acclaimed author and expert on Chinese domestic and foreign policy, and her most recent book, which everybody needs to read, The World According to China. So I'm delighted to have the three of you here talking with us about U.S. China relations. Let me actually first turn to John, and then I'll turn to Jan, and then to Liz. So John, the relationship between the U.S. and China, it's not in a great place. How would you apportion responsibility for the decline in that relationship? Most Americans focus on how China has changed under Xi Jinping. The Chinese blame Washington. I found that when I was traveling to China recently, not a surprise. And they focused on the Trump administration's trade war and the restrictions on Huawei and other steps taken since. Given how you apportion responsibility, then what are the possible ways out of this spiral? Or have you succumbed to the fatalism, which I've heard in both capitals? So John, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I actually apportion all of the blame to the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. Jan has been there since 1971, and look where we are now. I couldn't resist, Jan. I'm sorry about that.
Thanks, John.
But seriously, no, Jan is
my friend.
You are my friend, my dearest friend. And no, but the story really, Scott, for the last nearly half a century is the evolution of China, the rise of China, and what we're really talking about is the massive changes in China's capabilities and to some extent interests. Wang Jisi, whom you know very well and you've invited to the U.S. This past year, said to the Bloomberg New Economy Forum 3 years ago in a public setting, he said, the reason we have a problem in this relationship is because China has changed. And I think that's pretty patently obvious. The U.S. can't get by scot-free, however. I mean, we've changed in some important ways, and one of them is in the nature of the way that our democracy functions and the influence of social media, the news cycle, lack of responsibility amongst political leaders, and the challenges for any American president to actually manage this relationship. So we have some blame to shoulder as well. But I think the main story is that China has changed its expectations for what it wants from the world and what it wants from us and what it wants for itself.
Well, that's helpful. Thank you very much for helping us get started. Let me turn now to Jan. So you've been at the National Committee for a little while, all to the upside to the relationship, despite what John has just said. And so you've been integral to people-to-people diplomacy over that period. Has the deteriorating official relationship in zero COVID reduced people-to-people ties to where they were when you first joined the National Committee? Let me put the question another way, if I could. We often hear about business as the ballast in the relationship, but now that doesn't seem to be so true. How about people-to-people relations? Can they, or rather, are they now performing this role? Jan?
Well, thank you, Scott. And let me say what a joy it is to be on a panel with three people that I admire so much and three good friends. So thank you for having me. I should apologize. My voice may get increasingly hoarse as we talk. I just came out of a bout of 4 days of laryngitis. So if you see me reaching for a cup of tea, that's the reason. Or maybe I'm just, the laryngitis came from depression over the relationship and where it's going. But I do want to associate myself with what John just said. I think certainly both sides are at fault. China has changed, yes, but the United States has changed in several ways as well. And I think we need to be looking to ourselves for, we can't apportion all of the blame to China. We have to be very self-cognizant and realize that we are perhaps not looking at the relationship in the ways we might, and that we need to take a closer look at that. But in getting to your question, Scott, I would say if we're looking sort of at the first part of your question, sort of literally, whether people-to-people ties are where they were when I joined the National Committee on U.S. China Relationships, then the answer has to be no. Because as you said, I came to the committee a long time ago, 51 years ago, to be precise, in September of '71, at a time when only a handful of Americans had been to China and no PRC individuals had been to the United States. So we were really, excuse me, basically at ground zero. So that began to change actually right after I arrived. I had been in the Foreign Service and had taken a year's leave of absence to come to the National Committee to help work on the visit of the Chinese ping pong team, which was slated for the spring of 1972. And when I say that things changed right after, I mean it literally. On September 15th, 2 days after I arrived at the committee, Gray Diamond, who was a Kansas City doctor who was a friend of Edgar Snow's, he and three other doctor friends and their wives crossed the border at Luwu into China and became basically the beginning of a wave of left-leaning doctors and scientists who went to China to begin this people-to-people relationship. Actually, they weren't the first since the PRC had been founded. There was a group that barely gets any mention, which always surprises me, a group of about 40 young American students who were in the Soviet Union for a communist youth conclave and went on from there to visit the PRC. This was in 1954. For 6 weeks, despite a U.S. State Department ban on travel to Red China, and much to the chagrin and extreme unhappiness of the U.S. government. So people-to-people exchanges in terms of Americans going to China had begun, certainly the sort of energized by the surprise invitation of the Chinese ping pong team to the Americans who were with them in Nagoya, Japan for a ping pong tournament. So the invitation that brought a group of about 15 Americans to China for the first time in sort of an official or semi-official. It was a people-to-people exchange, but clearly both governments had to be in it first, or had to be involved in it, because there's lots of stories around, but it's clear that it was Chairman Mao who made the decision himself to say, yes, we should invite the American ping pong team to China. But the US government had to take certain actions that allowed that to happen too. So once the dam broke and the Americans went there, the Chinese came in the April of 1972, and they were the first Chinese from the People's Republic of China to step foot in the United States. The people-to-people relationship grew sort of by fits and starts over the next 7 or 8 years, with mainly 2 organizations spurring that on. The Committee on Scholarly Communication was the People's Republic of China in Washington, doing all the medical, scientific, and scholarly exchanges, and the National Committee sort of doing everything else, but starting in the fields of dance and sports and culture, etc. But by the time of normalization in '89, full normalization in '89, 1979, and actually 1973, when we opened liaison offices, helped an enormous amount. Sorry, normalization in '79. '89 was a totally different milestone, I'm sorry. 79 normalization, my apologies. Once we got into the 80s and 90s, people-to-people exchange was going full blast. It was no longer just the National Committee or the Committee on Scholarly Communication that had the ability or the right or the approval to get involved in people-to-people work, but everybody and their cousin got into the act. We looked around and said, whoa, we were once important, but look at what's happening now, which basically was what we had wanted. You know, we were just a small organization and had no way to be able to be involved in one tiny little fraction of all that took off after 1979. So the people-to-people programming that grew, it did slow down, of course, for a few years after the tragic events of 1989, but it gained momentum, I felt, surprisingly quickly after that. And over the past 5 decades, we have built up, I believe, a deep web of people-to-people relationships that, now to get to the second part of your question, sorry to make the first part so long, but yes, I do believe that it is no longer business that's the ballast, but that it's the people-to-people relationships that keep things going. As the sort of the nation-to-nation relationship gets worse, it's the people-to-people relationship that I think must get better. As you said, Scott, the sort of extreme downward vicious cycle of the relationship between our two governments has made engagement more difficult, but from my perspective, it's made it all the more important. So people ask me a lot, how it is that I can have the same job for 51 years? It's an easy answer for me. It's because my primary interests are in people. I'm not a policy wonk like Elizabeth or John or you, Scott, or lots of other people I work with. I'm more about what energizes me and what motivates me is bringing people together. People I think will learn from one another, will like one another. And I think that at this point in our relationship, it's the people-to-people aspect that's keeping us going. That's true, I think, the subnational level, certainly not at the national level, but subnational level, there's a surprising amount going on. We just ran a conference in conjunction with the University of Michigan's Lieberthal Rozelle China Center and the Michigan China Innovation Center that was a very lively, active drawing together of about 30 people who work on various aspects of China at the state and city and regional levels. It's at least prior to COVID, it was the educational level, with millions of PR students having come to the United States to school, primarily colleges and universities, but also middle school and private schools and public schools all around the country. Unfortunately, the exodus of China scholars from the United States has diminished recently, clearly because of COVID, but also probably equally so because of things that we've done in the United States, the China Initiative, the anti-Chinese racism, I was going to say perceived, but also real threats of violence that people from abroad see here in the United States, but also due to the nationalism in both countries and in China, the increased access to high quality education at home. It's also this web of people-to-people relationships. There's another aspect of it that's interesting. Not as many people talk about, and I don't know why, but and I don't even know the numbers on this, but the huge number of intermarriages that we've had in this country, the relationships that have been forged among families. So those are just three aspects of people-to-people relationship that go way beyond the business. And the business isn't just about business. It's also, there's people-to-people relationships in that as well, with training programs, etc. So I can hear your voice trying to interrupt me, so I will stop.
I would listen for hours if I could, and I think everything that you said is on the mark, and I appreciate not only your larger perspective but very tangible examples of how people-to-people diplomacy functions, and I think a lot of people aren't aware of these specific things, so I really appreciate it. But I do want to bring Liz into the conversation as well, and so Liz, you've, just like Jan, John, and myself, spent much of your career as an outsider, as a scholar, but you're temporarily serving in the Biden administration. And I know today your role is as a Hoover Institution expert, but I still want to ask you this question about, and I want to ask you about how, excuse me, sorry about that, about how the change in perspective has affected your view about the challenges facing the U.S. China relationship and the prospects of building guardrails. Are you more impressed by the challenges presented by the U.S. having such a huge government with lots of actors and the pressures to focus on the day-to-day, or by the efforts for people within the government to engage in long-range planning and coordination and to make guardrails?
Is that the end of the question, Scott?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. No worries. So it is great to be here. I actually don't think that the challenge of building guardrails between the United States and China is one of is a human resource issue. The U.S. government, as I've come to find in the past 15 months or so, really does have a pretty good mix of people, both whose job it is to think long-term and strategically, and and others who focus on the day-to-day, and others who really are mostly focused on implementation. I do think there are challenges around this notion of guardrail, though, and of guardrails. So maybe I'll just say a couple of words about that. First, I think is just defining what a guardrail is. Because I think, one definition is that it's really just about preventing the relationship from spiraling down into kinetic conflict. And if that's the way that you conceive of it, I think the temptation is to think of it as focused primarily on, State Department diplomacy or, Defense Department mill-to-mill relations. But I think what came out of the meeting between President Biden and President Xi was really a broader notion of channels of communication across a wider array of issue areas, so that if problems arise, that there are a lot of cross-cutting connections that could be drawn upon to stabilize the relationship. So you saw coming out of the Xi-Biden summit discussions of food security and public health and climate change, macroeconomic stability issues, as areas where not only, mill to mill, but areas where we really wanted to develop these guardrails. I think it's also true that the relationship is, so multifaceted that there are clearly elements of competition and cooperation, and sometimes it can appear as though, these are competing priorities that cannot be reconciled. So I'll just say, at the Department of Commerce where I work, we have a very robust ongoing dialogue on intellectual property rights between our Patent and Trademark Office and it's, a couple of different counterparts actually in China. We also have an export promotion strategy that we've started around personal care products, right? We want our companies to compete and do business and win business in China. And at the same time, as you certainly know, and I think probably everybody watching this knows, commerce is the epicenter of export controls through our Bureau of Industry Standards. And so, how do you reconcile those? I mean, export controls are generally considered to be things that are going to provoke conflict, right, between the United States and China, contribute to conflict. But I think you can change the dynamic in a couple of ways. What I've observed is, first is by articulating a broader strategy for the relationship that makes sense of these competing priorities, right? And that's the kind of longer term strategic thinking that you raised. And I think Secretary Blinken did this very much in his, outline of the U.S.'s sort of diplomatic strategy, invest, align, compete. And I think the Secretary of Commerce, Secretary Raimondo, my boss, also did it in her speech at the end of November, where she sort of laid out how things like export controls, fit together with a range of other priorities that we have in our economic relationship with China. So I think, that's part of how you can, reconcile these competing priorities. I think the other part is to turn something like export controls into an area of conversation with the Chinese. And I think that's what has happened with intellectual property rights protection, because one could imagine, and has been in the past, a very conflictual area between the United States and China, right? China, we know, is a significant appropriator illegally of U.S. IP. And so it's a source of, ongoing contention in our relationship. But at the same time, we do have this, really excellent and, as I said, robust dialogue. And that contributes to, sort of capacity building in China, where China has developed stronger IP laws, it developed IP courts. And of course, the U.S. can't take credit for all of that, but I'm confident that that kind of interaction has contributed to sort of the PRC's development of these laws and better enforcement, albeit certainly not the level that we would want to see. So I think, again, you have this mix of different people doing different kinds of jobs, people focused on the day-to-day, people focused on strategic thinking, and they kind of come together to sort of make, I think, for a good policy around, guardrails. But let me just also point out, and I think we just saw this, that, it does take two to tango. And while the U.S. has, repeatedly stated that it wants guardrails, to establish guardrails, to work with China, to establish guardrails in the relationship, we saw in the wake of Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan that China basically shut down all the big dialogues, like our PTO, our Patent and Trademark Office dialogue continued actually. It was a little bit, I guess, below the radar, but, they shut down, for example, the mill-to-mill dialogue. And, so that, what does that suggest about the level of PRC commitment to developing guardrails if they use it as punishment, right, for something, for an affront that they think the United States has somehow paid to China? So I think that's just another challenge that we have to address. It just does depend on both sides being willing to talk and work together constructively. But overall, I think I've been pretty positively impressed by the degree to which, our policies can come together in smart ways, given the sort of different kinds of roles that people play in the U.S. government.
Well, I'm glad that you found that, because you have very high standards, and if people that you're working with impress you, then they ought to impress the rest of us. And I know that you're making a positive contribution and on a number of fronts. I guess when I think of guardrails, because we not fully defined what guardrails are, but I kind of think of them as that both sides understand that the other's goal is not to eliminate the other, absolutely not, but that some amount of coexistence is going to continue, and that if we're going to compete, there's going to be common rules of how to compete. And so if you can accept that the other is going to be there and you're going to compete according to some rules, then to me, that's the guardrails. And sometimes those guardrails are made through an agreement consciously. Sometimes it's how we react and socialize each other in the wake of problems or crises, in the case of what happened in the summer with regard to the Taiwan visit and how China responded. Looks like, from what I hear from you and John and Jan, we are still building those kinds of guardrails, that common understanding that would let us compete in a way that wouldn't feel like we were spiraling out of control. I was curious to sort of, China seems to be richer, more powerful, healthier, safer than just about ever. I know there's something going on right now with zero COVID, and I'm going to come back to that with the next question. But broadly speaking, compare China today to where China was 150 years ago, even 15 years ago. It's doing much, much better. So why the anxiety in China about its relationship with the rest of the world? Why do they feel like they are under siege, which is leading to them to push back in the way that you all have? What is it that we don't understand about China that is generating such a critical response when they seem to be, in all objective measures, being so successful? Any of the three of you, welcome to take that on. Liz.
I mean, I just spoke, but I'll just say, I think I probably would challenge your premise, at the outset, Scott. I guess I don't see necessarily that China is, a better place across the board than it was 15 years ago, let's call it. I mean, richer, probably technically that is the case. Healthier, probably not right at this moment. Just better off. And I think given the level of repression, given the level of polarization. I mean, look at what's gone on with, women in China over the past 10 years, women's access to, healthcare, the educational system, the political system, the economy. World Economic Forum does a ranking every year of 140 countries, and China has fallen over this decade from 69th to 113th. Right now, one woman in the Politburo, 4% in the Central Committee. So I think, to me, I look at the tensions with, ethnic minorities. I look at the gap between the rich and the poor. I look at, the gap between what we would call the creative class and the bureaucratic class. And I see a lot of problems. I mean, and then there are just those technical problems like the property sector, right? Longer term demographic issues. I mean, if I were sitting in Xi Jinping's shoes, I'd be concerned, right? So I think domestically, there are a lot of problems that China needs to address. And I think on the global front, on the international front, I think, China has been its own worst enemy. And I'll be quick here because, I want to hear what Jan and John have to say. But I do think, Xi Jinping had a giant opportunity during the Trump era to step up and demonstrate that China could be really a constructive leader, on the global stage. But we saw virtually none of that, right? And we didn't see China step up to forge a new agreement on climate change or take leadership or ownership in any significant positive way. Instead, we ended up with, wolfware diplomacy, how it, the economic coercion against, a range of countries from Korea through to, Australia and zero COVID. China proved to be a relatively, albeit not completely, so I don't want to overstate the case, but a much more unattractive, force in the global system, I think, than many people would have anticipated. Even when it had a positive initiative like the Belt and Road, you saw that, it created a back reaction because of, weak labor and environmental standards, the lack of transparency. So even as it, was promoting something that I think on the face of it was quite constructive, right? Helping to fill the global infrastructure gap, the way that it pursued the policy ultimately led to, I would say, as many challenges as successes. So for me, I'm not surprised that it's in a challenging situation, that it feels under siege. I think both domestically, any country, right, that's got to use a couple 100 million surveillance cameras to keep, its population, under control, I think is one that is actually quite brittle, quite fragile.
Sure. Thank you. Go ahead, John.
Just add to that. I think Liz has done a great job of outlining the domestic challenges that China has been facing. This has been going on for a long time. It antedates Xi Jinping, certainly, but it's been accelerated under his rule. There's one way to think about this. It's an imperfect analogy, but think for a moment that the CCP and the Standing Committee is the CEO and the top executives of a corporation. They don't have a board of directors in China, right? There's no board of directors saying that that's going to fire the CEO. However, leading countries around the world have opinions, and they pipe up and they criticize China, and this is uncomfortable, and it's led to this action-reaction, this prickliness and hypersensitivity that does seem to be counterproductive for China. Bilahari Kausikan, you may all know, was recently quoted as talking about China's own narrative of its century of humiliation and its revanchist notions that come out of that, in a sense, they bind China to certain actions that are ultimately not good for itself. So I think this is worth a lot of thought. And the guardrails that we were talking about earlier, if we're talking about channels of communication and understanding of strategic imperatives in both countries, this is important because we have areas where you could have kinetic conflict, and we need to understand where things stand. And I would add to a different way of thinking about guardrails is there is an element of deterrence involved. So certainly the one flashpoint we have is Taiwan, and if one side feels that it is emboldened to kind of abruptly change the status quo one way or the other, you could have a problem. And I think so. There's a deterrence element in all of this that Kevin Rudd has written eloquently about, and that our strategic thinkers are engaged in very, very much. One final quick comment about people to people. We have a $750 billion trade relationship. That involves an awful lot of people, business people talking to each other. And so I agree with Jen that people is important, but let's not forget that some of those exchanges are in fact occurring by business folks as well. So I just add that to the mix.
I was just getting started on that, but that's when Scott rightfully told me I was talking too long.
No. Okay. I actually agree with both of you. I just think in material terms, China has done a lot better. It is that sense of victimization, which gets them to see the world, I think, in a frame that makes them feel more under siege than they ought to. And I think they're a creator of a lot of their own domestic problems in terms of governance and surveillance and things like that. If they lightened up and liberalized at home and were more collaborative, I think they'd actually be in a way better place. And Xi Jinping, when he spoke at Davos in January of 2017, if he'd implemented half of the stuff in that speech or even a tenth of it, they would have done much better than they've done now. Let's turn to zero COVID. And I'm curious how zero COVID intersects with U.S. China relations, either as an opportunity or as a risk or as a window into how China is operating that the U.S. is going to have to figure out how to deal with. Speed bump problem short-term or a sign of long-term challenges that we face. I have to tell you, even having been there and seeing that people were upset, that I did not expect the level of protests, and I don't think anybody expected them to drop zero COVID in 10 minutes the way they have. And so I really feel confused about what's going on in China and where they're going. Supposedly this strong man that people have described, yet we're seeing a very reactive policy process, not a lot of communication clarity. And so where are things going to be going? take any part of that out there to react to, if you would. Maybe Jan?
Yeah, well, I think we should try to use this as a way to point out that everybody was so surprised. Now, partially that's because none of us have been there for the past 2.5 years, with the exception of you, Scott, and one or two other folks who've been figured out ways to make that work. And I think that's a huge danger for us. The fact that we no longer have this large numbers of students in both countries, large numbers of businessmen going forth, large numbers of Chinese businessmen coming here to be trained, but particularly in the academic sphere, in the way in which academics can talk with one another and help understand things better. It was a lot of what Ken was talking about in his, what I thought was really a wonderful opening talk, the importance of having the ability to sit down and talk with a friend that's become at least somewhat trusted over years or several decades of going to the same conferences together and having those walks in the woods or meals together in a coffee shop. That's really important for helping us to understand the other side. And I think the fact that everyone is so surprised at the way China has reacted to COVID, especially, 2 weeks ago, it was our surprise that they were acting one way. And today it's our surprise that that's just suddenly turned into poof, nothingness. And it's a whole new world. And we really need the interaction that a strong, stable relationship, maybe with guardrails, so that we can feel that it's a trustworthy endeavor that we're engaged in. But we need that interaction in order to figure out what each other is doing and in order to figure out each other's mentalities. So I hope we take this as an example that we need to do a whole lot more of that and do it much better than we did in the past.
John or
Liz?
Liz?
I would just say, I think I don't disagree with Jan's point on the necessity of ramping up again in terms of, scholarly exchanges and definitely getting more U.S. students into China. I think, there are still hundreds of thousands of Chinese students studying in the United States, and the other side is just pitiful, I think, at this point. So I saw some number like 11,000. I don't know, Jan would know much better, but I think that was pre-COVID even. So I think,
that's 300. 300.
Yeah.
Pre-COVID?
No. Today's
No.
300.
Yeah. I meant pre-COVID, though, I think, if we were to come back. But in any case, but I probably disagree a little bit that even if we did have very high levels of academic exchange and student exchange, et cetera, that we would have predicted what just happened in China. I mean, I think the Chinese were caught off guard. I don't even just think it's us. I think everyone around the world has been shocked by the 180-degree change in Beijing's policy on COVID. I think the protests, are less surprising in some respects. We saw something similar around the death of Dr. Li Wenliang. And, anybody who knows China knows that dissent is always percolating, right? China didn't go from 180,000 documented protests in 2010 to like zero now simply because nobody disagrees with the government and is unhappy with the direction in which things are going. It's simply because the repressive apparatus has been so great. So it's always there. That potential always exists. But I have to say, for me, I would never have predicted. I certainly did not predict this shift in Xi Jinping's approach. What I do think it enables, Scott, is an approach from the United States, to offer assistance. Because we know, there are shortages of, fever medication and other things. And as the, hospitalizations ramp up and perhaps even deaths, ramp up, we are in a position, I think, to offer assistance. And so I think there is that opportunity to engage in a positive way around this issue. So that's what I would say it provides at this moment.
The question is whether China's pride will let it accept that kind of assistance. We offered that during the during COVID initially, as well as more recently, and for a variety of reasons, it wasn't accepted.
Yeah, I mean they did take the drug Paxlovid, but
Paxlovid.
Yeah, they did
Small number of
accept
doses.
that. So
Small
yeah,
number.
I mean, you
Not
never
too many.
you never know if things really move to a dark space. It's hard for me to believe that they're going to accept. I mean, even taking the really dark side of the argument, which would be that simply because Xi Jinping's legitimacy in the COVID space has rested on basically no deaths in China, right? If you really started to see deaths ramp up, I think he would be hard pressed, other than going back to significant lockdowns, not to accept some assistance from the rest of the world.
Well, if I read correctly, Zhongnan Shan was saying that this version of COVID will have a morbidity level of 0.1%, which, you do the math, that's 1.4 million deaths in China. That's what he'd be expecting now. I don't know that I haven't heard the Chinese say that, but I think the COVID has really done a lot of damage to U.S. China relations. It's prevented us from interacting with one another. And I think from a public perception, most Americans will look at China and they'll say, my God, what are they doing? First of all, they've not been very forthcoming on what actually happened to begin with. There's that narrative. And then there's this massive hyper-totalitarian control of the population, which they've all of a sudden reversed and said it's not that important. It's baffling, and it's not doesn't contribute to a positive narrative about China in any way.
Yeah, I think
it may be a less threatening one, John. Maybe seeing that people will step back and say what Scott was saying, or someone was saying before, that they don't necessarily, they may have a plan that's followed, but it isn't always necessarily the right one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess just to give my own 2 cents on this, I think, yes, it opens some opportunities for aid and for more people-to-people exchanges. 11,000 American students pre-COVID, 300 there, 400 there on the ground now, so we could resume that. And perhaps they're signaling a more responsiveness to the public, and maybe that may be some practicality, which suggests maybe they'll be more practical on other things. But I think we're also seeing, continued sense of uncertainty and unpredictability about where they're going and about how decisions are made. And I think that will affect how they negotiate and what they're willing to negotiate on a whole range of issues. I think it's also going to be unsettling for for foreign businesses that are in China, because again, it's what they've wanted is certainty and predictability, and ending zero COVID in general provides a little bit more, but the way you end it also affects the sense of predictability and certainty. And so companies that have been doing, modestly, shifting supply chains or going to China plus 1, 2, or 3. I don't know if what we're seeing now makes them want to reverse that. I think actually it leads them in the direction they were already going, which I think is towards some further amount of decoupling in a variety of different areas. So I think it's again, a lot of our issues with China is about how they do things as opposed to what they do, and the how now I think is concerning. So if we look forward towards 2023, intensified tensions, more stability with better guardrails, some sort of breakthrough. Where do you all put your money on where we'll be in a year from now when we have you back for the second annual Big Data China Conference?
Well, I'll offer bookends here for us. One is the Biden-Xi meeting in Bali. The next would be Xi Jinping's visit to San Francisco in November next year, right? So this is a period where there's an opportunity for diplomacy. We've seen Quittenbrink and others preparing for Blinken's visit. The Chinese clearly want to engage. Can you get any action and results from these conversations? I don't know. But that's going to be clear. I hope that I would be cautiously optimistic that there will be fewer fireworks in the next year and some maybe progress on a few areas.
But John, can that happen given the hardening of political attitudes in the United States. You talked before about blaming a lot of things on cable television and social media where you can just listen to the person who agrees with you all the time. I just see an atmosphere that is so very hawkish that an inability for people to speak even the slightest thing about China that's positive without being labeled naive at best or an enabler, an agent of the CCP at worst. So I think that it's going to be very tricky. I would hope that things will get better, but I think the mood in this country is just, and in China, and both countries are very nationalistic, and most political parties, as we've seen, don't see any electoral benefit in taking a more conciliatory approach with China. So I'm usually the optimistic one,
yeah,
but I'm not so optimistic.
But progress doesn't need conciliation.
Right,
Yeah.
right, exactly. I think we can find common ground on the kinds of issues that Presidents Xi and Biden outlined, or President Biden really outlined in the Bali meeting, without actually, Jan, having to sort of take some kind of, or change the way that we frame China. We can still say these are global challenges that necessitate the two largest economies working together in order to solve. And I think, as President Biden has said, it's not only to our own benefit, but it's also what the rest of the world wants from us. And so I think that will be the frame, that will be the argument, more than necessarily we're looking to bridge the divide of friendship with Xi Jinping and mainland and the Chinese Communist Party. But I don't think working together constructively necessitates, changing the way we think about the challenges and the downside of what's going on in China today.
Sure.
But as we all know, China can sometimes be its own worst enemy. And as you mentioned before, Liz, your concern about Chinese sort of picking up their marbles and going home on a number of issues where one would have hoped they would have stayed and worked constructively. And so I would hope that you're right, that we can find, whether it's climate issues or health issues or a whole variety of things that we all need to be concerned about. And the mantra that it takes the world's two largest economies and greatest superpowers to resolve the problems of the world. I just hope that both governments and both peoples can keep an open enough mind to keep your vision on target and going forward without saying, okay, that's it, we don't like what you did, we're going home.
Yeah.
And we don't play very well in the same sandbox, unfortunately.
Well, as Mao said to Hua Guofeng, Liz, with you there, I'm at ease. So I want to thank you, Liz. I know that you've got to run off. Can you stay around a little bit longer, or do you need to go?
Wait. No, I do have to go. But can I just say, Scott, that's like a terrible,
terrible
predictor of what is likely to come.
No, we ended up with
Hua Guofeng in this. I mean, I guess that means I'm out, but Deng Xiaoping will rise. So, okay. On that note, thank you. I do have to go, but thanks so much again for the opportunity to participate.
Okay. Cheers.
See you later.
See you later. Bye.
I meant it as a compliment. And maybe there's things about Hua Guofeng that he did right that people don't know. So no, Liz is, I was grateful to have her with us, and she contributed a lot to this discussion. I know she's working hard every day in a positive way. Let me ask two questions to wind things up to both of you, going up a level and then down a level. Up a level, I want to talk about the U.S. And its relationship with allies and others. There's been, I think this administration has highlighted that coordinating China policy with allies is extremely important, and they've expended a lot of energy in interacting with colleagues in Asia and Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, as well as in Europe. What do you think is missing from the conversation that the U.S. is having with its allies about China? What would you recommend that we do to adjust that conversation, whether it's about government to government or people to people? What should be done?
If I could take that on, Scott, I think we're doing an awful lot, and it didn't start with this administration. these conversations have led to some significant deepening of understanding and between us and allies. The one thing that is central to all of this, that's really focused minds this year, has been the military exercises about Taiwan when Pelosi visited the island. And this is the single issue that I spend more time on than anything else. Business leaders are worried that there's going to be a war over Taiwan or some other coercive activity that will lead to sanctions and a deterioration of security and economics in the region. So, and what we're seeing now is we're seeing European and Japanese and Korean business leaders in conversations with the Chinese saying, if you have a war, global supply chains of chips it'll be destroyed. The world will plummet into a massive depression. Be careful here. And I think if we can somehow make progress on this issue, set guardrails so that there's a little bit less worry that a war is imminent, that would be the single most important thing that can be done. It's also the single most difficult.
Jan?
Well, John is the expert in this. I am not a maven when it comes to these things, but just from what I read, it seems that, yes, the Biden, and I know the Biden administration feels very strongly about bringing its allies in, and they look at what happened in the past administration and saw the dangers of not doing that. But sometimes I wonder just how productively they are doing it. I mean, some of the recent export control issues and other, some may call them guardrails, the Chinese may look at them very different ways, or the things that the Chinese perceive as holding them back and our desires to contain them. I'm not so sure we had really deep talks with some of our European or other allies about just how far those were going to go and how much those could affect them as well. I just seems to me that there was a different reaction that maybe I would have expected if I'd been talking to my allies openly and honestly about all this.
We really are down to just a final few minutes, but there's a question that I think is really important for us to talk about briefly, which is about localities in the United States and their relationships with China, sub-state U.S. China relations. I was just out in Indianapolis, and I had been a professor at Indiana University for 15 years and was talking to my colleagues and meeting businesses. And the conversation that I heard in Indianapolis didn't sound like the conversation I heard in 2014 and 15. There are states are thinking about all different kinds of restrictions related to China now that they hadn't ever thought of before. And I'm trying to figure out to what extent this is a top-down effort where the federal government and the leadership of the political parties are pushing their initiatives onto state governments, and to what extent this is bottom-up where we're seeing localities generate restrictions because of the worries about competition with China economically, or their own views about the direction that China is going. And so maybe we're seeing a little top down, a little bottom up. But anyway, what do you think? What is broadly speaking, where do you see, local relationships going between parts of the United States and China? What should we be looking for? What should we be worried about? Maybe what can we do? Jan, this is right in the middle of your wheelhouse.
I think it depends on where you are in the United States. Because it definitely varies by region, varies by sector. I've had several local experiences lately where we've been doing a 50th anniversary ping pong diplomacy tour, and it's taken me to Raleigh and to San Jose and to Houston and other places. And we just, as I mentioned very briefly before, National Committee, along with the University of Michigan's Lieberthal China Center and Michigan China Innovation Center, ran our second symposium on subnational U.S. China subnational relations. And we found when we were, so that we held our first one back in April of 2019. The second was supposed to have been in April 2020. That finally happened a month ago. And we found some states said, look, when we went to invite the same people we'd invited the year before, they said, we just can't come. Our governor says, absolutely not. We're not working with China. The mayor of our city is opposed to it. But on the other hand, we found a lot of interest in other states and in other regions, the Bay Area, around the Philadelphia area, Jobs, Ohio. There are people at the local level who still see working with China, John, primarily on the business level, but now a lot of the state governments are very upset about the huge reduction of Chinese students coming into the public universities because they provided their tuition, provided much needed funding for a whole variety of things. So I think it really is mixed, and it depends where you go and it depends what you're talking about. But I was surprised at the amount of enthusiasm we had, but also concerned, is it dangerous for me to be going and doing XYZ with China? Is U.S. government going to come down on me and squash all of this? Am I going to get my mayor into trouble, etc.?
Jan, I agree with everything you said. I have to run. I'm late for another meeting. Scott, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I appreciate it.
You, Scott.
Yeah, stay there. Okay, so I'm ready to wrap it up now. A whole day's first annual Big Data China conference where we've looked at China domestically and also globally. I want to thank Jan, John, and Liz for joining this panel for a discussion about whether or not we can build guardrails in the U.S. China relationship. And it looks like we may be able to, but we're also facing some significant challenges. I want to thank the panelists who joined the first discussion on China's economy and then on COVID. I want to thank Stanford University and the Center for China's Economy and Institutions and their co-director, Scott Rozelle, and his team. I want to thank CSIS Broadcasting for helping us technically run today's event seamlessly. For my team in the trustee chair, who has worked diligently not only for this conference, but all year long, and including Ilaria Mazzacco, who has just done a tremendous role with each of the features that we've produced over the past year. I hope folks will continue to follow our work through Big Data China. You can do so by going to Twitter and following the trustee chair's handle, as well as Stanford University Center for Chinese Economy and Institutions. And you can go to csis.org and subscribe to follow us and receive all the stuff that we produce as it comes out. Again, thank you all for joining and look forward to future conversations, future features. And wherever you are, hope you have a very good day. Thanks so much.